Chapter 339. They walked on the mountain for a day and killed countless small animals, which became their lunch at noon. Finally, they arrived at the mountain stream with a light brown stream in the evening. The stream gushed out from under a rock and flowed down for about 100 meters before flowing into a crack in the ground. With the test results from the black pool, Rinpoche was more confident this time. This must be the other kind of brine that he had found. Rinpoche continued to dip his finger in the water and licked it. Although it was poisonous, this amount wasn't harmful. Similarly, it was salty and bitter. It tasted even worse than the black pool, causing him to shudder. Then, he delightedly dipped his index finger in the water and licked his middle finger. Not bad, it's a little sweet. Rinpoche nodded. How is that possible? Nagu didn't believe it and wanted to try it. However, there were people who acted much faster than her. A few students copied Rinpoche's actions and dipped their fingers in the water to lick them. Their faces twitched like dried orange peels. Liar! Tong Lon pointed at Rinpoche and accused him. Don't you think it's sweet? Rinpoche was surprised. Does this water taste different in different people? As soon as he said this, the other students also tried it. Then their faces twitched. Pairs of hateful eyes were cast on Rinpoche. Science is like this. No matter what others say, it can't compare to trying it yourself. Not only do you have to try it, but you also have to think about why. Rinpoche put on a kind face and guided them patiently. You are obviously lying to us to try it, Tong Lon said disdainfully. Her eyes kept looking around to see if there were any wild fruits. Then her eyes lit up. She jumped 7 or 8 meters away and plucked a bunch of wild fruits that were as big as red cherries. Then she proudly put it into her mouth. You will know my painstaking efforts in the future. As Rinpoche spoke, he threw a piece of white rabbit creamy candy into his mouth. The expression on his face immediately relaxed. Get some water, Rinpoche said. This time around he took more than 20 bottles. If this brine was as he thought, he had to test the ratio of it with the black brine. There was no harm in bringing more. After all, it was a bit further away from here. After the guard filled the bottle with water, he looked at the sky and asked Nagu, Is there a place nearby where we can spend the night? The shortest way is half a day's journey. We wasted too much time on our way here, Nagu said. Then let's see if there's a suitable place around here. Come back in an hour and hunt some prey along the way, Rinpoche said to the guards. Most of the guards immediately dispersed, and some of the students followed suit. Can the black pool in this place really produce edible salt? Nagu asked after the guard left. It should be possible. Rinpoche didn't sound too confident. So your village might not need to hunt in the future. If we don't hunt, what are we going to eat? Nagu felt that Rinpoche was talking nonsense. Even if they could get their hands on salt, they wouldn't be able to eat it. In the future, there will be a salt factory in this mountain that belongs to the Ministry of Works and the royal family. You can choose to work in the salt factory. That way, you won't need to hunt so hard. Of course, you can also continue to hunt, but I'm afraid you will have to travel very far. With so many people, the prey will definitely be scared away. Alternatively, you can apply for compensation and move your village to another place. Oh! Nagu nodded. Rinpoche looked at her and thought that she would have a bigger reaction. After all, their village had always been here. Will there be salt to eat in the future? Nagu asked. She seemed to be more concerned about this issue. After all, in her opinion, there were countless prey in the mountains. Even if they couldn't hunt it today or tomorrow, they would be able to hunt it the day after. They wouldn't starve to death. She didn't think that the development of a salt factory would affect the village. However, she knew that there would be no strength without salt. Rinpoche nodded. If there wasn't enough salt here, then they would hunt to the coast of the Yun Nation. There would definitely be salt there. That's good, Nagu said happily. Sir, can salt really be produced here? The two officials from the Ministry of Works asked loudly with faces full of disbelief. It was only now that they realized why Rinpoche had brought everyone to the mountains. Rinpoche took a closer look at the two of them and recalled their identities. Their presence was too low, and he had almost forgotten about them these few days. Rinpoche nodded. However, we still have to go back and study the specifics. Great, this is great. The two of them said repeatedly. Salt was a knot in everyone's heart. For so many years, there had been no solution, and it had always been in the hands of the merchants from the other three nations. Now that they could actually produce salt here, the two of them were really excited. After a while, all the guards returned. One of them found a suitable place. It was a corner between two mountain walls, and they only needed to pay attention to the beasts on the other two sides at night. There was also a protruding rock above that could shelter them in case it rained at night. Renbachien brought everyone to have a look. It was already good enough that they could find such a place in such a short time. Next, everyone dispersed to look for prey. The animals in this area were considered unlucky. Even if they went into a hole, they would be caught by a few students. When the sky turned dark, everyone returned. They had caught a dozen small animals that looked like deer and were called dwarves. More than 40 fat animals that looked like mountain rats were strung together. There were also 2 pythons, a flower bear, and a number of wild fruits. Renbachien saw the innocent panda that died unjustly and went up to give it a kick. "Sir, although this thing is a little unpalatable, we can't find much to eat in such a short time," the guard said with a face full of grievance. He had an expression that said, "Sir, just make do with it." Furthermore, there were so many other prey. Even if this thing was unpalatable, it wasn't for you to eat. Forget it, hurry up and deal with it. Leave the bear paw for me. Renbachien stared for a long time and finally sighed. The panda was a national treasure on Earth, but in this place, it was an animal that didn't taste good and could be found everywhere. Other than acting dumb, it didn't know how to do anything else. Of course, its attack power wasn't weak and was similar to that of a bear. Next, he found a place near the mountain wall to rest and watched as the guards started a fire. The other guards and some of the students brought the prey to a nearby water source to deal with it. 2 hours later, Renbachien used 2 wooden sticks to hold 4 bear paws and flipped them over the fire. The aroma of the barbecued meat and seasoning drifted out. However, it wasn't just the bear paws in his hands. The other meat that was being roasted over the fire was also emitting a similar aroma. Renbachien waited for the bear paw to cool down a little before taking a bite. The taste was average and not very fatty. It was even worse than pig's trotters. He immediately lost the desire to continue eating. He threw the bear paws to someone else and took 2 dwarf beast legs to gnaw on. The taste was much better. As the moon rose higher and higher, the howls of wild beasts could be heard from afar. Occasionally, the sound of animals running in the forest could be heard. Everyone wasn't worried about wild beasts attacking them. If they really came over, they would have a midnight snack. Unfortunately, they didn't get a midnight snack. Instead, they got a downpour. The weather in the mountains changed abruptly. From the moment the first drop of rain fell on their faces, the rain continued to pour. In less than a minute, more than half of the fire had been extinguished. Everyone shrank under that huge rock. "Look after the top, don't fall." Renbachien exhorted again and again. He was afraid that if the soil loosened, the huge rock would smash him into a meat patty. "Don't worry, sir." Sherhu turned his head. His face was drenched in rainwater. Many guards stood outside, shielding Renbachien and the students from the wind and rain. It rained for 4 hours. The guards outside were almost completely drenched. Early the next morning, Renbachien and the rest ate some wild fruits to fill their stomachs before setting off on their way back. It rained last night and the mountain path was much more difficult to walk, especially since the leaves were covered in water. By noon, everyone's bodies were wet and dry. It wasn't until nighttime that everyone returned to the stronghold with their stomachs rumbling. They had almost wiped out the remaining rations in the stronghold. The hunting team that had gone out had yet to return after 2 days. If they didn't return tomorrow, everyone would probably starve. After resting for a night, Renbachien drove most of the guards out to hunt the next morning. All the students went to the riverside to fish with their fingers. As for himself, he basked in the sun in the stronghold. At night, the guards who had been driven out to hunt returned with game. The 2 hunting teams also returned with game shortly after. Finally, everyone didn't have to go hungry. At night, Rinpoche brought the two types of brine back to Earth and got the laboratory to test and find out the ratio. By the time he returned to Daeyo, he was completely at ease. There were no longer any problems with salt production. Just as he turned on the radio, he heard the furious voice of the Empress. Li Qianxiu, how many more days before you arrive at Yuxing City? Your Majesty, my vanguard will arrive tomorrow. Wait for the entire army to arrive before attacking and killing them all, the Empress said coldly. Li Qianxiu replied in a deep voice. Rinpoche's heart skipped a beat. Did something happen to Yuxing City? Could it be that the city had been breached? How could it be so fast? Daeyo was really ferocious. After listening for a while, he finally understood that Yuxing City had indeed been breached. Furthermore, a great Xia sect had dug a tunnel directly into the city. Afterward, a large number of practitioners from the great Xia sects entered the city through the tunnel and set fire everywhere. Outside, there were 100,000 great Xia soldiers attacking ferociously. In just half a day, the city was breached. Less than 300 of the 2,500 soldiers had retreated, and 5,000 of the 40,000 civilians had died in battle. Yes, they had died in battle. The ordinary civilians of Daeyo also had considerable fighting strength. However, it was still difficult for untrained civilians to affect the overall situation when faced with 100,000 great Xia soldiers and numerous experts from the great Xia sections. In this battle, the great Xia army suffered more than 10,000 casualties, while Daeyo's losses were more than 2,000 soldiers and 5,000 civilians. The ratio of casualties between both sides had reached 2-to-1, which was already terrifying for Daeyo. One had to know that Great Xia currently had more than 500,000 soldiers at the front line, and there were still 200,000 soldiers in Great Xia ready to set off. The entire military strength of Daeyo, including the new recruits who were still in training, was only 110,000. The current confrontation with Great Xia consisted of 30,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North, 8,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center, and 1,200 winged cavalry warriors led by the Empress. There were only 50,000 soldiers. So far, after the two battles at Ziyue City and Yuxing City, the Daeyo army had already lost more than 6,000 soldiers, while the Great Xia army had lost less than 70,000 soldiers. Among them, the Great Xia sects had played a huge role. Chapter 340. 2 days later, Tong Jingye rushed to Nine Peaks Mountain. Upon seeing Rinpoche, he picked him up and shook him like a little chick. Sir Ren, is what you said true? Can salt really be produced? Tong Jingye's boorish face was filled with excitement and nervousness. He was afraid that Rinpoche would say no. Put me down first. Rinpoche shouted. Tong Jingye's claws were like iron pincers, and he was almost seeing stars from the shaking. Tong Jingye loosened his grip. Rinpoche fell to the ground and almost fell. What hatred! Rinpoche looked resentful. He almost fell apart from the shaking just now. Sir Ren, is what you said true? Tong Jingye asked anxiously. Why would I lie to you? Rinpoche rubbed his shoulders. Previously, when Rinpoche said that salt could be produced here, the Daeyo official chat group immediately went silent, following which voices of surprise and disbelief could be heard. After hearing the news, Tong Jingye rushed to the Shi residence and asked about the situation before rushing over. Is there salt? Tong Jingye asked. I'll wait for you to come, Rinpoche replied. Don't worry, I'm at least 80% sure. For such a big matter, you must be 100% sure, Tong Jingye said in a deep voice. It's useless to say so much. We'll know once we try. Have you brought the things you want? Tong Jingye asked someone to bring in 2 large buckets filled with milk. However, due to the weather in Daeyo, the milk had already gone bad. In addition, there were large pots, sieves, and coarse cloth. Rinpoche also asked someone to bring out a few large buckets of brine. These were the brine that he had asked people to bring back from 2 different places. Come and help. Rinpoche called out to the students. Immediately, a few students ran out. At this moment, the empty space in the middle of the village was surrounded by students, guards, and officials from the Ministry of Works. On the contrary, the Aboriginals in the village were pushed outside. Most of them still didn't know what was going on. They only heard from Nagu that they were going to use the 2 types of poisonous water to produce salt, but most of them didn't believe her. The water was indeed salty, but it could also poison people to death. Now, it seemed that another high-ranking official from the imperial court had arrived. Record the process, Rinpoche reminded. Then, he got someone to pour the black brine and yellow brine into a basin according to a certain ratio. Very quickly, small pieces of white crystals appeared at the bottom of the basin. When the sulfate in the black brine and the barium in the yellow brine come together, they will form barium sulfate that is insoluble in water, Rinpoche said to the student beside him. Although they hadn't learned these things yet, it was still a rare experimental experience. After asking someone to filter out the white crystals, Rinpoche said to Tong Jinya, "Keep this barium sulfate and store it as it can be used elsewhere in the future." After that, it was time to fry the salt. Rinpoche got someone to start a fire and boil the brine before pouring a portion of the buffalo milk into it. Logically speaking, it would be more reasonable to use soybean milk. However, soybeans were only grown in the southern part of Great Xia, and they were called soybeans. Dayo, on the other hand, had none. After asking around on Earth, he found out that he could use dairy products instead. It was very expensive, but salt was even more expensive in Dayo. The proteins in the milk can precipitate the high-velocity ions in the brine and can absorb the residues. Rinpoche continued. Although the surrounding students were listening, they didn't understand at all. Proteins, high-velocity ions, barium sulfate, and so on were completely incomprehensible. This was the case for the students, and it was even more so for Tong Jinya and the other people from the Ministry of Works. However, they still tried their best to record the process. Before the effects of frying the salt could be seen, the smell of milk from the pot assailed their nostrils, causing many people to feel hungry. "Did you bring rations? There isn't enough food in the stronghold for so many people," Rinpoche reminded. Tong Jinya had brought a few dozen people with him when he came. Now, there were more than 100 extra mouths in the stronghold, and they were all strong and had huge appetites. One had to know that the more powerful the Aboriginals were, the bigger their appetites were. Although the hunting team had brought back some prey and the guards had caught some small beasts, the food in the stronghold wasn't enough for so many people. Tong Jinya glanced at Rinpoche. He didn't need to remind Rinpoche, as Tong Jinya knew the situation of the strongholds in the mountains better than him. After that, everyone ate while waiting. There was a large group of people in the middle of the stronghold, but they were now sitting on the ground instead of standing. The Aboriginals were watching from a distance. During the frying process, they had to use a strainer made of coarse cloth to scoop out the impurities from the water from time to time. This went on for 8 hours before they stopped adding water to the pot. The water in the pot gradually evaporated, and a layer of white crystals began to appear on the wall of the pot. "Is this the salt that is made?" Tong Jinya, who had been watching from the side for 8 hours, was shocked. Not only him, but the others were also shocked. One had to know that even though there were only a few people and 2 pots, what they were doing affected tens of millions of people in Dayo. "It's still lacking a little," Rinpoche said. After a while, when the water had completely evaporated, he got someone to scoop out all the white crystals from the pot, shake them on a dense bamboo sieve, and then pour some water over them. Most of the salt didn't dissolve with the water, and the remaining impurities almost dissolved in the water and flowed down. "Is it done now?" Tong Jinya looked at the remaining layer of white crystals on the bamboo sieve. His eyes lit up as if he wanted to pounce on it and lick it. Rinpoche dipped his finger into the salt and put it in his mouth. Then he nodded and said, "Let's dry it." Without saying anything, Tong Jinya dipped his finger into the salt and put it in the water. Then he burst into wild laughter and said, "Dayo finally doesn't have to suffer from a lack of salt." Not only him, but the students also cheered. Dayo had suffered from a lack of salt for decades. Back then, it was because the salt was poison that they were attacked from the mountains and destroyed the entire Hao nation. Even so, Dayo still didn't have salt. For so many years, both the people at the foot of the mountain and the Aboriginals had suffered from a lack of salt. After so many years, Salt had long become one of the most important resources in the hearts of the people of Dayo. It was difficult for outsiders to understand the importance and desire of the people of Dayo for salt. Although they didn't do anything other than fishing this time, they were able to witness the production of salt from the brine with their own eyes. They could also understand the significance of this to Dayo. It was like a poverty-stricken person suddenly discovering a mountain of gold. Furthermore, Rinpochen was the principal of the academy. The more impressive Rinpochen was, the more it proved that their choice was correct and that they could learn more things from him. When the aboriginals saw the people in the middle of the stronghold cheering crazily, they also became restless. This was because they had heard what Tong Jinye said just now. However, they still had doubts in their hearts. Was this salt edible? One had to know that the water in the black pool could poison people to death. Rinpochen looked at them cheering and a smile appeared on his face. In any case, he had accomplished something again. However, he didn't have to laugh for long before he couldn't. Shirgan, Du Laolu, and the others grabbed his hands and feet and threw him up. Rinpochen's eyes widened. I can understand that you guys are happy and you guys are throwing people to celebrate. However, who has ever seen someone being thrown up 4 or 5 stories high? Rinpochen felt as if he was sitting on a dirt plane. He was thrown more than 10 meters high and let out a series of screams. C, I'm afraid of heights. Whoever throws it at me again, I'll shoot him. Chapter 341. When everyone started to calm down, Rinpochen tidied up his robe and said to Tong Jinye, although we can produce salt, there is still a problem that we need to pay attention to. What problem? Tong Jinye was startled. He had just received good news and was afraid that Rinpochen would say bad news. The distance between the two outlets is a small problem. Although it consumes a lot of manpower, Dayo can afford it. Rinpochen pondered for a while and said, Dayo has a population of 30 million. Even if one person consumes 1 kilogram of salt a year, 1,000 people will consume 1 ton, and 10 million people will consume 10,000 tons. This amount is too large, Rinpochen said. This was calculated based on the fact that the average intake of salt in Dayo was much less than the average person on Earth. The normal intake should be double what Rinpochen said. Rinpochen calculated in his heart. The pot of brine just now should have produced 5 kilograms of salt, and the proportion of salt produced was about 4%. This meant that 100 kilograms of brine could produce 4 kilograms of salt. With the strength of the Dayo people, they could at most carry 200 kilograms of brine on the mountain roads, which produced 8 kilograms of salt. Not to mention the problem of containers, it would take 2 days to go to the yellow brine and back. Even if the place where the salt was boiled was placed between the black brine and the yellow brine, it would still take a day and a half. It was the same for the black brine. Including the rest time, it was equivalent to one person bringing back 4 kilograms of brine in 2 days. 1 ton of salt could be produced 180 times a year, regardless of rain or shine. In that case, at least 10,000 people would be needed to transport the brine. In addition to boiling and drying the salt, at least 11,000 people would be needed. However, in reality, 20,000 people would be needed. After all, transporting the brine was actually hard work. In addition to those who made the containers, transported the water buffalo milk, and transported the ingredients, a total of more than 20,000 people would be needed. This was calculated based on the minimum consumption of 1 kilogram of salt a year. If Dayo's salt production was sufficient to meet its daily needs, it would require even more manpower. At least 10,000 more people would be needed. Of course, this price was acceptable for Dayo to pay for salt production. The problem lay in another point. The main problem is that the amount of brine can't keep up with such a large consumption, Rinpochen said after some thought. The Blackwater pool is still all right. I've paid attention to the place where the yellow brine comes out. There should only be 20 to 30 tons of water flowing out in a day. That's too little salt production. The flow rate of 20 to 30 tons was far from Rinpochen's requirements. Even with a considerable amount of black brine mixed in, only about 2 tons of salt could be produced. 700 tons of salt a year was too little, not even 1/10 of the total consumption. At first, Rinpoche thought of expanding the area, but later on he felt that this wasn't a good idea. Because the water flow was small and not rapid, it meant that it wasn't just the problem of the exit, but the distance from the underground to the exit wasn't long. Does Sir Ren have an idea? Tong Jinye asked. There's one thing. Well, drilling. Since black brine and yellow brine can be produced, it means that there is more than one sealed underground seawater lake. If we dig a well in a suitable place, we can bring the spring closer, save manpower and resources, and also solve the problem of insufficient brine. That's easy. Tong Jinye chuckled. If it was any other problem, he would be worried, but digging a well was not a difficult task. What if it's a few hundred meters or 1,000 meters deep? Rinpoche asked faintly. Furthermore, it wasn't just a well. The location of the seawater lake was too deep, and it was difficult to determine its location. At present, all they knew was that there was an 80% chance that they could reach it by drilling in the vicinity of 2 springs. However, the distance was too far, and it was difficult to meet Rinpoche's requirements. Rinpoche didn't believe that there weren't seawater lakes in other parts of this mountain. In the long run, drilling a well was more suitable. However, this wasn't something that could be done overnight. One had to know that in ancient times on Earth, it would take a year or even a few years to drill a well. The Aboriginals were strong, but they wouldn't be of much help in this matter. Let's build the salt boiling plant first. If there isn't enough yellow brine, we can use another method that only uses black brine to boil salt, even though it's slower. I just hope that the black pool can last a little longer. Rinpoche thought for a long time and felt somewhat helpless. This was a problem that he had raised, but it wasn't something that could be solved overnight. Even if they were to dig wells at multiple locations at the same time, they might be lucky enough to find 1 or 2 that could be used. However, it would take at least a year. That night, Rinpoche made another trip to Earth. When he came back, he brought along something that looked rather strange. It was completely black, had a thin tube at the front, and was slightly longer than Rinpoche. In addition, there were a few heavy boxes. What's this? Lin Xiaola was a little curious. Just a little preparation. In a few days, I will teach Great Xia how to behave, Rinpoche said confidently. At the same time, he despised that bunch of stingy people. It took a lot of effort to obtain a heavy machine gun and ammunition. Even though the matter of the salt pan hadn't been completely resolved, he was already making preparations to look for the Empress. This was the Type 8512. 7mm anti-aircraft machine gun that he had just obtained from the nation. It was 15 meters long, weighed nearly 19 kilograms, and weighed 18 kilograms. It had a theoretical firing rate of 650 to 700 rounds per minute and an effective range of 1,600 meters. Within this range, it could split a person into 2. Rinpoche was a little excited at the thought of bringing this thing to the battlefield. At that time, he would definitely get someone to take a photo of his heroic appearance and leave it for future generations. He would be the legendary Rambo Rin. For the next 2 days, Rinpoche accompanied Tong Jinye to the Black Pool and the Yellow Brine Spring. He also found a location that he felt was more suitable to build a salt pan. At least, this location didn't require too many detours. Furthermore, after cutting down the weeds and trees along the way, it was easier to carry the container and walk. At the same time, he also selected 7 or 8 locations to prepare for drilling wells. According to Rinpoche, he had a unique technique for selecting locations. In any case, other people would have to rely on blind guesses, so he might as well do it himself. What if he guessed correctly? Every night, he would explain to the people from the Ministry of Works about the design drawings of stop drilling. Stop drilling completely relied on people to step on the pedal and used the principle of leverage to drill. It was slightly more advanced than a single-cylinder well and was already the best method in this world that didn't use modern machinery. Your Majesty, Dayo's letter has been sent back. In the palace of Great Xia, an old man sat on a high chair with 2 rows of civil and military officials standing below. Read it. The old man revealed a smile on his face. At present, 500,000 soldiers had already entered Dayo's territory and opened up a path. 200,000 reinforcements had already arrived at the border, and 300,000 new soldiers were still training in Great Xia's territory. His goal was to conquer Deyo with an army of 1,000,000 soldiers. At present, the development of the war had also reached his initial expectations. After opening the door, Deyo was already like a young girl that could be manipulated by anyone. However, Deyo's letter should have been sent before the war started. He didn't know what that little girl from Deyo wanted to say and how she would explain it. Although no matter what she said, it was impossible to make Great Xia retreat. Listening to her explanation and combining it with the current progress of the war, it was still quite amusing. Xia Jingdi and Xia Jiulong were sitting on high chairs, feeling very satisfied. Chapter 342. Xia Bailong looked at the eunuch beside him and didn't speak for a long time. Then he softly uttered, causing the eunuch to shudder. "Your Majesty, please forgive me. This handwriting is really hard to read." The eunuch immediately knelt on the ground. "Get up. It's not easy for a bunch of barbarians to be able to write." Xia Bailong laughed. As though he had pressed a switch, the ministers below also burst into laughter. Their smiles were filled with contempt. "Your Majesty is right. It's already not easy for those barbarians to be able to write. We can't ask for more," a minister echoed. Xia Bailong nodded in satisfaction. Your Majesty, I'm old and have poor eyesight. I really can't recognize the handwriting," the eunuch said carefully after reading the letter. Even though Ren Baqian found it hard to recognize himself, it wasn't to the point where he couldn't recognize him at all. However, as someone who had been serving Xia Bailong for a long time, he understood his temperament very well. If he really read this letter, he would definitely not be able to get anything out of it. Even if he was fine in the short term, after a period of time, he would find an excuse to die without a burial ground. Eunuchs like them relied on the emperor's favor. If the emperor was dissatisfied with them, countless people would want to step on their bones to climb to the top. "You can't even read a letter properly. Get lost," Xia Bailong snorted coldly. "Li Kairue, you read it." A spirited old man with grizzled hair and beard took the letter and read it in detail. A strange expression appeared on his face. "What? You can't even recognize him, Grand Secretary?" Xia Jiulong sneered. Li Kairue was the tutor of the Great Xia dynasty as well as the Grand Secretary of the Zhaoyang Dojo. Naturally, he would not be like the eunuch just now. He just smiled bitterly and said, "The words in this letter are somewhat disrespectful to His Majesty." "Speak." Xia Bailong coldly said. "I would like to hear how disrespectful you are." Li Kairue laughed bitterly in his heart, then cleared his throat and said, "The Empress of Deyo to His Majesty of Great Xia, my old friend was as arrogant as you, and now the grass on his grave is 5 feet high. Looking at the grass on my grave, I think of my old friend. An old friend is like a ruler, his grave is like grass on his eyebrows." The first sentence was changed from the original Xia Baichong. After all, these words were too unpleasant to hear. However, the rest of the content was told truthfully. When Li Kairue was halfway through reading, the smile on Xia Bailong's face froze. By the time Li Kairue finished reciting, Xia Baichong's entire body was emitting a cold aura, and the armrest of his chair, which was made of pure gold, had a deep fingerprint on it. Everyone below was dumbfounded. No one expected Deyo's letter to contain such content. It was simply a direct insult. "Old friend like you? 5 feet of grass on his grave? What kind of words were those? Still thinking of old friends like you? An old friend like a ruler, with grass on his brow at his grave?" This was simply a hooligan cursing in the street. Originally, everyone wanted to ridicule the Empress of Deyo and tried their best to explain. However, they still wanted to beat her up. But at this moment, no one could say anything. The Empress of Deyo had no intention of explaining at all. He immediately started scolding. Although Ren Baqian had previously thought about the reaction of the Empress of Deyo, a normal person would at least explain a little, right? Even if he brushed it off and said that he didn't know about the 7th prince's death, he would still be able to save face. How could this be? How could the prideful Xia Bailong accept this? How could these people, who had always regarded themselves as the strongest nation, accept this? Everyone felt that no matter what the Empress said, they would still beat her up, and that she was already a hooligan. They didn't expect her to be as strong as them. She started with a limerick and started scolding right away. Qi Zixiao actually dared to do this? Xia Bailong's chest heaved up and down heavily as he cursed, I must capture her and bring her back to Zhejiang. Let's see if she can still be so stubborn. Please calm down, Your Majesty. She was just venting her words, Li Kairui said in a deep voice. I know, but she actually dared to humiliate me like this. Xia Bailong was furious. After that day, Xia Bailong had a headache, and it was difficult for him to sleep at night for many days in a row. If he knew that his impulsive letter had caused the Empress of Great Xia's blood pressure to rise to the point of having a cerebral hemorrhage, he would probably be so proud that he would immediately write about it in his so-called records of the Grand Historian. Apart from discussing with Tang Xinye and the others about the location of the salt works, the manufacturing process, and the drilling of the wells, he would also learn about the situation at the front line from the radio. After Yusheng City was breached, the army of the Protectorate of the Center finally arrived at the front line. Previously, 1,000 soldiers were sent to Yusheng City to assist in the defense, but all of them perished after the fall of the city. The remaining 7,000 soldiers and Yusheng City didn't fight with the Great Xia army. The other party was guarding the city, and it was difficult for the 7,000 soldiers of Dayo to attack. If they were to forcefully attack, not only would they fail, but they would also suffer a lot of casualties. As a result, they attacked the 70,000 Great Xia soldiers outside Gyuk City one day later. Together with the remaining 1,000 soldiers inside the city, they killed half of the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers, leaving behind at least 20,000 corpses. More than 10,000 Great Xia soldiers were scattered outside, and only half of them retreated to Liao City to join the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers there. At this time, there were still 5,000 soldiers left in the Protectorate of the Center. At this time, the Empress was approaching Liao City and was using the radio to communicate with Li Qianxiu from time to time. She was preparing to attack the 120,000 Great Xia soldiers in Liao City. Only the aboriginals could use 6,000 people to fight against an army of 120,000. Renbaqian found it hard to accept that 1,200 of the 6,000 winged cavalry warriors were at least at the Earthwheel level. After all, the education on Earth was about hundreds of thousands of soldiers surrounding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, and they had received this education for more than 20 years. Now, a few thousand soldiers were fighting against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Even though he knew that the strength of an Earthwheel expert wasn't comparable to that of an ordinary army, this number still made him feel uncomfortable. Renbaqian sat on the ground with a drill model in front of him. He gently tapped his finger on a small piece of wood behind the model, and the drill bit drilled into the ground with the help of a lever. It didn't take long for a small hole to be drilled. The surrounding students looked curiously at the model that Renbaqian was fiddling with. Although they had learned a little physics, it was all theoretical, and they only talked about optical fibers. This was the second time they saw a mechanical model that could be used in real life. As such, they were very curious and carefully observed it. This was what they wanted to learn in the future. The first time they saw Renbaqian's motorcycle, which had been successfully turned into a pile of scrap metal. After fiddling with the model for a long time, Renbaqian retracted his hand and said to Tang Xinye, "This is basically what happened. The rest is up to you guys." "Sir Rin isn't staying here?" Tang Xinye was slightly stunned. "It's about time. I'm going to the front line to take a look," Renbaqian said casually with the aura of an expert who looked down on his enemies. Those who weren't familiar with him wouldn't be able to tell that he was acting cool. "Sir Ren, it's better for you to stay here so that everyone can be less worried," Tang Xinye said with a strange look on his face. Previously, he had been assassinated twice, and each time, Her Majesty flew into a rage. Now, he still wanted to go to the front line? Should he say that he was magnanimous or that he didn't know what was good for him? As long as you stay here peacefully and don't get into any trouble, that will be the greatest contribution you can make. Renbaqian stared at him and said, "Do you really think I'm made of clay? I don't even have the ability to protect myself? Let me tell you, I'm even afraid of myself when I get angry." You're really made of clay. Tong Jingye nodded seriously. Chapter 343. When they went up the mountain, they brought a bunch of glass bottles. When they went down the mountain, they brought a bunch of metal sheets and wooden boxes. Renbachien held a Type 85 rifle that was even longer than his body and pointed it at it from time to time. "Teacher, what is this?" Shurgon came over and asked. Everyone had been pondering over the thing in Renbachien's hand for a long time. No matter how they looked at it, it looked like the gun that he used in the classroom. But how big was that one? How big was this? If this was used on a person, the consequences would make everyone shudder. "Do you want to know?" Renbachien smiled kindly. "Yes." Shurgon nodded his head honestly. "Stand there and let me shoot a few times." Renbachien pointed to the side. "Teacher, I didn't make any mistakes these days." Shurgon looked wronged. "You can only know the power of this thing after experiencing it yourself." Renbachien's face was full of kindness. When Shurgon saw his smile, he shrank his neck and ran to the back of the crowd. However, Renbachien really wanted to test the power of this gun since he hadn't used it since he got it. At the foot of the mountain, Renbachien asked someone to bring over a small metal box. After opening it, there was a rolled-up ammunition chain inside. He pressed the ammunition chain on the anti-aircraft machine gun, set up the tripod, and aimed in the direction of the forest. Everyone looked curiously at Renbachien fiddling with that strange-looking tube. The guards were curious about what it was, and the students were curious about how powerful it was. Renbachien grabbed the handles on both sides of the back end and pulled the trigger at a big tree in the forest. The muzzle immediately emitted a half-meter-long flame. The moment the sound was heard, the metal chain stretched out from the top of Renbachien's head like an antenna. The flame and the loud sound startled everyone. They were even more dumbfounded when they saw the scenery in the forest. From the time Renbachien held the trigger to the time he stopped, only 10 seconds had passed. A big tree in the forest that required 2 people to wrap their arms around first saw sawdust flying everywhere. Soon after, half of the tree was gone, and it fell to the side with a creaking sound. That was a big tree that required 2 people to wrap their arms around. Even an earth wheel aboriginal expert with a weapon would have to exert some effort to break it. But now, it fell to the ground just like that. This power made everyone feel apprehensive. "Teacher, can I play with it?" Tong Lan ran to Renbachien's side and spoke in a lovely voice with a smile on her face. If she had a tail, she could also wag it at this moment. "Dream on," Renbachien said as he dug his ear. This thing was pretty useful, but the sound was too loud. The recoil was still bearable with the help of the tripod to reduce the recoil. Of course, he was confident of his strength even without the tripod. Of course, of the recoil. After all, the strength of his hands was close to 350 kilograms, and his physical strength was even greater. It was not impossible for him to bench press up to 450 kilograms, which was already the best on Earth. Unfortunately, this gun was not designed to be used by a single person. The trigger was on the handle at the end of the gun. If one did not use a tripod, they would have to place the gun on someone else's shoulder. Humph! Tong Lan wrinkled her nose in dissatisfaction. Tong of Tong of Otherwise, 60 rounds would be used up too quickly. Renbachien only had a total of 20 ammunition chains. There were 2 small boxes in a big metal box, which were 2 ammunition chains. In addition to the other ammunition that he had not brought back, he would need a team of 4-corned cows to carry ammunition for him when he went to the front line. When Renbachien hung the gun on the 4-corned cow's back, that group of students swept up all the bullet casings on the ground and took them back as souvenirs. Just like when Renbachien was young, even a bullet casing could be regarded as a good thing. Following which, it took them 1.5 days to return to the city. Renbachien was somewhat surprised to see Shurqing coming to greet him. "Sir Ren, you have done a big thing this time," Shurqing said as he pulled Renbachien's arm. The production of salt was too important to Dayo. Even Shurqing couldn't sit still. Knowing that Rinpoche had returned to the city, he hurried over to meet him. After dismissing the students, Rinpoche chatted with Shi Qing for a while before returning to the palace with the guards. The empress wasn't around, and the palace was without a master. Although there weren't many people who left with the empress, it gave off an even more desolate feeling. Rinpoche walked in the palace and felt a little bored. The empress wasn't here, and this place didn't have any significance to him. The weather was obviously quite hot, but it made him feel a little bleak, as if it was late autumn. Back at Pingle Park, Rinpoche turned on the radio station and asked, "Is Her Majesty there?" There was no response for a long time. It seemed that the empress wasn't near the radio station. According to the route, she might reach the vicinity of Liao City today, which was also the front line of this war. She might encounter the Great Xia army at any time. Although Rinpoche had absolute confidence in the empress's skills and had 1,200 winged cavalry warriors, he still had some lingering thoughts in his heart. After walking one round in the courtyard, Rinpoche found something that he had almost forgotten about in the room next door. TNT explosives. Originally, he wanted to use it to blow up the mines, but unfortunately, he didn't use it. Now that he was going to the front line, there was nothing more to say. In addition, there were still 2.5 bottles of sarin gas and the antidote. He carefully wrapped them up and might need to use them when the time came. Rinpoche turned to look at Lin Xiaola, who was dozing off in the corner, and asked, "You are going to leave again tomorrow. Aren't you going back to Qingxin Palace Hall to say goodbye to Librarian Lin?" Lin Xiaola yawned and continued to doze off, as if she hadn't heard what Rinpoche said. "This time, you are going to the battlefield. There are spirit wheel experts everywhere, and earth wheel experts are inferior to dogs. With your skills, it might not be safe for you to go," Rinpoche threatened. Lin Xiaola finally opened her eyes. Her confusion gradually became clear, and then she had a thoughtful look on her face. "Protecting you on the battlefield is much more difficult than protecting you here. You have to double the amount of candy." Lin Xiaola, who had been pondering for a long time, opened her mouth, and Rinpoche was speechless. "You're finally smart about this. Other than muscles, there's only food left in your brain, right?" Rinpoche couldn't be bothered with him and asked someone to prepare a medicinal bath for him. While bathing, he turned on the radio station and asked from time to time, "Is Her Majesty around?" After he was done bathing, he heard a woman's voice from the radio station, "Is Li Qianqiu around?" "Greetings, Your Majesty. I will inform the Protector General now," another man said. "Your Majesty, have you reached Liao City?" Rinpoche took the opportunity to ask. "About 50 kilometers away," the Empress said faintly. "I have completed my task. Sir Tong is working overtime to build the salt pans. I have already returned to Lan City and will look for Your Majesty tomorrow. A day apart feels like 3 years. Now that more than 10 years have passed, I can't wait to set off." Rinpoche's voice was full of smiles. Chapter 344. Early the next morning, Rinpoche left the city with his guards and headed straight north. In the past, he had seen on TV that the generals had long weapons like broadswords and lances hanging on their horses, and each of them looked majestic. At this moment, Rinpoche was standing beside the fork-horned cow with a retracted Type 85 anti-aircraft machine gun. He felt that he was more awe-inspiring than them. Even though 2 days had passed, the guards beside him would still occasionally look at the 2-meter-long anti-aircraft machine gun. The test fire that day had left a deep impression on everyone. It took the Empress 13 days to travel from Lan City to Liao City. Rinpoche estimated that they would arrive in 9 days, and this was after he had to return to Earth for 2 days. At that time, he would be able to display the strength of the Tech Party and show them what it meant to be unparalleled. At the thought of this, Rinpoche's heart was on fire. He felt that his great spear was thirsty and couldn't wait any longer. Not long after Rinpoche and the rest set off, the Empress encountered the mounted scouts from Great Xia. When they were still a few hundred meters away, the other party encountered the winged cavalry's mounted scouts and turned around to run back. The goat riders were simply too easy to recognize. The winged cavalry was the only organized army that used giant goats as mounts. Furthermore, The winged cavalry was the focus of the Great Xia people, and they could be recognized just by looking at the equipment and mounts of the mounted scouts. A few winged cavalry scouts watched as the other party left, leaving behind a trail of dust. They turned their horses around and reported to the Empress. "Your Majesty, we have just encountered the scouts from Great Xia. I'm afraid they will know very soon." "How far is it from Liao City?" the Empress asked faintly. 50 li to go. Get ready to face the enemy," the Empress said faintly as she reclined on the thick hide of the golden throne. She supported her head with one hand and held a wine glass with the other. "Turn on the radio," the Empress said again. Hong Wan immediately turned on the radio. "Li Qianqiu, where are you?" the Empress asked. After a while, Li Qianqiu regained his composure. "Your Majesty, we have arrived at Pingjin Mountain." Pingjin Mountain was about 15 kilometers west of Liao City, and its speed was similar to that of the Empress's. This was also the reason why both parties had always been in contact. In a while, the winged cavalry will charge straight for the main camp of the Great Xia army after breaking through the intercepting enemy troops. At that time, the Great Xia army will definitely be in chaos. After breaking through the interception, you will seize the opportunity to launch a surprise attack. When the Empress said this, her face was slightly flushed and her eyes were as bright as the stars. It was unknown how much she was drunk or how much she was excited about the upcoming battle. As for whether the winged cavalry could break through the blockade, she had never considered this question. It would be a joke if 1,200 Earthwheel level knights couldn't break through the interception of the Great Xia army. At the east gate of Liao City, 25,000 soldiers of the Great Xia surrounded this place and took turns to attack. Towering ladders were being lifted up and placed on top of the city wall. War cries could be heard from every inch of the city wall. From time to time, people would scream miserably as they fell from the city wall. There were even more people lying silently on top of the city wall. A middle-aged general in iron armor stood in front of the tent, looking at the distant city wall, his brows tightly furrowed. This Liao City was simply too tough. 1,000 defenders, 2,000 soldiers who had retreated from Shun City, and the common people of the city had blocked the 70,000-strong army for a full 10 days. Countless corpses were left behind. At this time, a few mounted scouts quickly ran back to the camp. "Sir, we found traces of the winged cavalry 25 kilometers away." The middle-aged general, who was stroking his beard with his right hand, paused for a moment. Then he asked in a deep voice, "Do you have detailed information on the enemy?" "I encountered the enemy's mounted scouts before I could get close and returned to report to the general. However, from the dust I saw in the distance, there are only about 1,000 of them, not more than 2,000. They will be able to get close in about 4 hours. Quickly go and continue to investigate." Then, the middle-aged general raised his voice and said, "Someone, go to the main camp and inform the great general." An hour later, 15,000 of the 25,000 soldiers outside the east gate of Liao City headed in the direction of the Empress. At the same time, another 10,000 soldiers rushed over from the north of Liao City. Although there were only slightly more than 1,000 of them, Great Xia didn't dare to take them lightly. The strength of these 1,000 winged cavalry warriors was already equivalent to that of an army of tens of thousands. Furthermore, they were more mobile. Earlier, another 10,000 soldiers from the northern barracks of Liao City were dispatched to the west gate of Liao City and joined with the 30,000 soldiers outside the west gate. They surrounded the west gate and were also on guard against the 5,000 aboriginal soldiers near Mount Pingjin. The generals of Great Xia had been dealing with Dayo for more than 10 years. Naturally, they knew how powerful the aboriginal soldiers, whose weakest was at the man-will level, were. They also knew how powerful the 1,000 winged cavalry warriors were. At this moment, the winged cavalry and the Great Xia soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center, who had defeated the Great Xia soldiers from Gyuk City, arrived in the vicinity of Liao City. This made the Great Xia soldiers somewhat afraid to act blindly without thinking. They even felt that their military strength was somewhat stretched. Even the siege from 3 directions gradually stopped, allowing the defenders and commoners in Liao City to temporarily heave a sigh of relief. At this moment, only half of the 3,000 soldiers in Liao City were left. If it weren't for the commoners who went up to the city wall to pick up the weapons of the fallen soldiers to kill the enemy, they probably wouldn't have been able to hold on. One had to know that they had persevered for nearly 7 days under the fierce attack of the 70,000 soldiers. Then, they had persevered for 2 days under the joint attack of the 40,000 Great Xia soldiers who had retreated from Gyuk City. At this point in time, the city wall was in ruins. When one stepped on it, there would be blood everywhere. The smell of blood had already numbed everyone on the city wall. When the Great Xia soldiers retreated, it was unknown how many people were directly sitting in the blood. Most of them were ordinary commoners who Rinpoche felt were very simple. However, when they picked up their weapons, they caused the Great Xia soldiers to bleed profusely. Over the past few days, at least 20,000 corpses were left at the bottom of the city wall. The losses in Liao City were equally disastrous. When the Empress and the winged cavalry arrived about 5 kilometers southeast of Liao City, they saw the Great Xia soldiers blocking their way. At a rough glance, there were at least 20,000 of them. Their halberds and spears were as dense as a forest, and many of their armors were stained with blood. An austere and somber aura swept over them. The ground in front of the battle formation was covered with rusty caltrops. Each caltrop had 4 spikes sticking out and a hole in the middle. 5 to 6 of them were strung together with ropes so that they could be retrieved after the battle. Crush them. The Empress stood on the golden throne and looked at the battle formation in the distance. Her body was overflowing with murderous intent. Dismount. Following the command, more than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors uniformly dismounted from their horses. Ha! Everyone let out a loud shout. The combined roars of more than 1,000 people were like an explosion, immediately causing a slight commotion in the front line of the Great Xia army in the distance. Kill! A man ordered. Kill! More than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors quickly approached the front line in 3 rows. Their hands were holding onto the hilts of their swords, and their bodies were emitting an ice-cold murderous aura. Even when facing an enemy that was 20 times their number, they didn't show any signs of retreating. This was the most elite winged cavalry of the Aboriginals. Shoot! A command was issued from the Great Xia army. With a buzzing sound, countless white feathers transformed into black shadows that blotted out the sky and the sun before crashing down again. It was like a rainstorm. At this moment, countless figures soared into the sky to meet the arrows. The long swords in their hands turned into rays of cold white light that shot down the rain of arrows. Shoot! Another wave of arrows was shot from the Great Xia battle formation. Another few hundred figures soared into the sky. Kill! The eyes of many winged cavalry warriors were scarlet as they stared at the battle formation in front of them. They leaped up, crossed over 10 meters, and went straight for the sea of spears in front of them. Like a tiger entering a flock of sheep, it set off a sea of blood. Looking from above, it looked like dozens of scalding steel knives had cut into a huge piece of cream. First, it was cut open, and then it melted on both sides. The battle formation of Great Xia immediately became fragmented. The Empress stood on the throne and drank a cup of wine. Then, she threw the wine cup to the ground and broke it into countless pieces. Following which, a red shadow crossed a distance of hundreds of meters in a few flashes, stepped on countless heads of the Great Xia soldiers, and pounced toward the rear of the battle formation. Her clothes were as red as blood. Peace, recommend a book? Suddenly transmigrated. Ever since I was young, I always had a bad habit. It was that whenever I had a nightmare, I would teleport. Therefore, when I was very young, I traveled to all the countries in the world. However, there was a bug in this habit of mine. I couldn't control the destination I wanted to go to. Just like just now, I was having a good sleep at home. In the end, I had a nightmare and instantly transmigrated to a warm and fragrant bed. Where was this? Chapter 345. The screams before death, the cries of despair, the sound of a blade piercing into a human body, and the sound of a human body being thrown to the ground. Countless sounds entered the Empress's ears, but she didn't seem to hear them. At this moment, she was sitting on a fine horse. Her hair was untied at some point in time, and her fine black hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Corpses were all around the fine horse. One of the corpses was a middle-aged general with glaring eyes. He was the commander of the 25,000 soldiers. However, his identity didn't help at all at this moment. Instead, it became the reason for his death. The great Xia commander was dead, and the soldiers began to flee in disorder. However, their running speed was far slower than the winged cavalry's pursuit. When they realized that no one could escape death in front of them and that no one would care about them if they fled to the sides, they quickly fled to the sides. The battlefield was in chaos. The Aboriginals ruthlessly bit off a huge chunk of the 25,000 soldiers' battle formation while the rest fled to the sides. "Your Majesty!" Countless blood-covered soldiers stopped in front of the Empress and regrouped. "Advance," the Empress said coldly as she turned her head and looked into the distance. The winged cavalry pounced on the 10,000 soldiers outside the east gate of Liao City like a wave. They had just received the news and organized their troops when they were attacked by the winged cavalry. Listen, what's that sound? On top of the city wall, the soldiers and commoners of Liao City, who were covered in blood and didn't even bother to clean up the minced meat on their faces, opened their eyes one by one and asked, "It's the reinforcements," someone shouted. "Reinforcements? The reinforcements are here." Upon hearing this news, everyone immediately became spirited. One by one, they climbed up from the ground and held onto the city wall to look outside. Too few. Someone was disappointed when he saw the number of reinforcements in the distance. A little over 1,000 soldiers was indeed too few. One had to know that there were close to 100,000 Great Xia soldiers surrounding Liao City. Even if these 1,000 soldiers charged into the city, it would be much more effective than fighting outside. However, just as this thought flashed through his mind, someone shouted excitedly, "It's the winged cavalry! The winged cavalry is here!" Although there were only 1,000 winged cavalry warriors, their strength was comparable to that of an Aboriginal army of 10,000 soldiers. This wasn't the only important thing. There was also the significance of the winged cavalry. The winged cavalry was here. Was Her Majesty coming? The people on the city wall looked around and quickly saw a person in red riding slowly from behind. Is that His Majesty? Many people only saw the red dot in the distance, but they couldn't see who it was. They could only guess that it was His Majesty. After all, the winged cavalry had already killed their way into the 10,000-strong army, and a red figure was slowly following behind them. Other than the Empress, no one else would have thought of it. Her Majesty is here with the winged cavalry. Such cheers gradually spread from the east gate to the center of the city, the north, and the west. The whole city fell into a state of ecstasy. A general wearing leather armor quickly rushed to the east city wall and looked in that direction with a pair of binoculars in his hand. His face fell into an ecstatic expression. "It's really His Majesty." At this moment, he had an urge to take those who could still move and charge out immediately. "I have fought alongside His Majesty in the future." However, when he glanced around and saw the deep exhaustion beneath the ecstasy on everyone's faces, he suppressed this thought to the bottom of his heart. When the Empress and the winged cavalry swallowed more than half of the 10,000-strong army, only a few thousand escaped. The Empress turned to look at the blood-stained city wall and continued to say coldly, "Advance." When the Empress and the winged cavalry arrived at the north of Liao City, they just happened to see the Great Xia army slowly retreating. There was a speed bump that was more than 100 meters long between the two sides that was filled with caltrops. More than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors and 5,000 Aboriginal soldiers were fighting fiercely with the Great Xia army in the west of Liao City. This caused Great Xia, which had already lost more than 20,000 soldiers and 30,000 soldiers, to voluntarily retreat. That night, the Empress and the winged cavalry met up with Li Qianqiu's army in Liao City. The winged cavalry only lost a few dozen soldiers, and Li Qianqiu's 5,000 soldiers from the protectorate of the center were only left with 4,000. Great Xia only withdrew 40,000 soldiers, and the number of injured soldiers they later regrouped was close to 70,000. 30,000 Great Xia soldiers died in battle. On the same day, the Great Xia army from Yusheng City continued to advance into the depths of Dayo. 2 days later, 200,000 Great Xia reinforcements crossed Ziyue City and approached Liao City. At the same time as the Great Xia reinforcements, 5,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the South set off in the direction of Lan City. They were prepared to intercept the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers who were advancing into the interior of Dayo from Yusheng City. At this point in time, Great Xia had already invested 700,000 soldiers. Of the 500,000 soldiers that were deployed for the first time, 200,000 were sent to besiege Tiesua Pass and Shun City, and the remaining 300,000 soldiers were sent to the 80,000 soldiers from Yusheng City and 70,000 soldiers outside Liao City. There was a total of 150,000 soldiers, as well as an unknown number of Great Xia practitioners from the sections. According to the estimates of the Protectorate of the North, there should be about 10,000 soldiers. Among them, the weakest were at the man-will level, and there were many earth-will experts. Even though they couldn't compare to the aboriginal warriors of the same level in terms of strength, the combat power of both sides was greatly reduced. Unless they encountered an elite unit like the winged cavalry, they would be able to cause considerable damage to the majority of the aboriginal army. This was especially so when they were mixed in with the ordinary Great Xia soldiers and suddenly appeared in small teams during the battle. They were especially threatening. The war had only started for half a month, and 150,000 soldiers had already been lost. The war in this world was more brutal and bloody than what Rinpoche knew. After all, the lethality of those experts was too great, and the ordinary people on Earth couldn't compare to them. An ordinary person might not be able to lift his arm after swinging his sword for 15 minutes, but a man-will expert could swing his sword for 2 hours. An earth-will expert wouldn't feel too tired even if he killed for half a day. On the side of the Aboriginals, only 22,000 of the 30,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North were left, 4,000 of the 8,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the North were left, and the civilian casualties in Ziyue, Liao City, and Yusheng City were more than 10,000. Every day, Rinpoche listened to the communications at the front line through the radio station and took notes of the current war-loss ratio. Excluding those killed by the winged cavalry, the current war-loss ratio between Dayo and Great Xia was 1:10. If the casualties of the aboriginal civilians who had considerable combat power were included, it should be within 1:10 or even 1:5. Such a war-loss ratio was acceptable for Great Xia, but it was unacceptable for Dayo. One had to know that Great Xia still had 550,000 soldiers, and the aboriginals could only mobilize the 22,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North, the remaining 4,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South, and the 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South. Even if the winged cavalry were to be used as an army of 10,000, it would only be slightly more than 40,000. Great Xia's confidence didn't only come from these 700,000 soldiers, but also from the 500,000 new soldiers that were being prepared. As for Dayo, they had 20,000 new soldiers and another 20,000 new soldiers that were being recruited. If the war-loss ratio was 1:10, the gap between the two sides' military strength would get bigger and bigger. This was also the first time that Rinpoche realized that there was actually such a situation where the enemy's casualties were 1/10 of the enemy's, but their losses were actually more severe than the enemy's. Chapter 346. Rinpoche's doubts were quickly answered by his own conjecture and the reply from the front line. The Great Xia army received a batch of rations from Yushue City, which was enough to last them for half a month. After that, they left Great Xia's supply line. As a result, their marching speed wasn't considered fast. However, they didn't care because the army of the Protectorate of the North had no time to pursue them. They only needed to attack the other cities within half a month. To put it simply, they were an isolated army. They relied on the fact that the Great Xia army was holding up the other armies in the north of Dayo. Their rations were completely their own. If they were blocked outside a city and couldn't advance, they could only rely on Great Xia's supply line to deliver rations to them at great risk. Otherwise, they would collapse when their rations ran out. However, they dared to let such an isolated army penetrate deep into the north of Dayo because they had something to rely on. All the troops that Dayo could mobilize were pinned down. In the interior of Dayo, there were only 200 to 1,000 guards in each town, which was completely unable to resist this well-armed army. Needless to say, there were a large number of practitioners in this army. Therefore, before the reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South arrived, Dayo was temporarily helpless against this isolated army in the interior. What they had to do was very simple: destroy. In addition to individual strength, Dayo's foundation in agriculture was already very weak. If they allowed them to destroy and a large number of refugees left the original cities, Dayo would collapse as long as the war dragged on. One had to know that there were a total of more than 10 million aboriginals. Most of them were in the 60,000 mountains, and there were about 3 to 4 million aboriginals on the plains. At present, Dayo could barely sustain them. If the farmlands and livestock were destroyed, a large number of refugees would emerge. Under such circumstances, the imperial court of Dayo would have to empty the treasury to ensure that these refugees didn't starve to death. Previously, Dayo couldn't even recruit 20,000 new soldiers with rations. After the war, they decided to recruit 20,000 new soldiers. From this, one could see how empty Dayo's treasury was. As for whether these refugees lived or died, don't forget that the refugees in Dayo weren't like those from ordinary countries who didn't have much fighting power. Dayo's civilians had considerable fighting power. At that time, Dayo would be the first to fall into chaos. Great Xia was also aware of this point. It would be best if they could advance in multiple directions. If they were stopped, they would definitely encounter a large number of Aboriginal soldiers. There were only so many Aboriginal soldiers. With a large number pinned down, the remaining Great Xia soldiers could move freely within Dayo's borders. Other than a small number of news from the front line, Rinpochian guessed. He didn't know whether his guess was accurate or not, but he knew that if he were in Dayo's shoes, he would do the same. Furthermore, doing so would cause considerable harm to Dayo. One had to know that the land in the north of Lan City was occupied by more than half of the Aboriginals. At this moment, it was completely exposed to the other party's blade. If the production resources of this land were destroyed, the Dayo would have been lost. However, Dayo would have Dayo. Great Xia believed that with the stalemate of the war, the destroyed areas of Dayo would be unable to restore production, and the fragile ecological balance within Dayo would be broken. The more food was scarce, the more difficult it would be for Dayo's internal situation. The more prominent problems there would be, the weaker Dayo would become. Just like a healthy person, if their immune system was destroyed, they would suffer from various diseases and eventually die. In Rinpochian's opinion, high-yielding crops like sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and potatoes would mature. Even though they couldn't be used as food for the army, they could still ensure that the refugees wouldn't starve to death. As Dayo's combat potential was unearthed, Dayo would become stronger and stronger. Don't forget that Dayo recruited 20,000 soldiers. According to the ratio, Great Xia had to recruit 200,000 soldiers. The Aboriginals could be considered soldiers. Over 10 million Aboriginals could recruit millions of soldiers. Could Great Xia do the same? Even though Great Xia's population was 10 times that of Dayo's, their training was much slower than Dayo's. Dayo only needed half a year, but Great Xia needed at least 2 years. When these elite soldiers were exhausted, would Great Xia send farmers to fight? Of course, there was a key problem. Sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and other high-yielding crops could fill their stomachs and stabilize Dayo. There were a few new crops that Great Xia didn't know about. Furthermore, Dayo's biggest trump card was Rinpochian. As long as there was enough ammunition and someone to stop the other party's experts, Rinpochian felt that he could defeat 10,000 soldiers alone. Rinpochian looked back at the ammunition boxes on the backs of a few fork-horned cows and continued to write and draw in his notebook. What he wrote was his analysis and conjecture of the current war. Rinpochian felt that, based on the current situation and his conjecture, if the war continued, Great Xia might cause considerable damage to Dayo, but it would be difficult for them to completely defeat Dayo. Unless, Great Xia still had other trump cards that they hadn't used. As for whether his conjecture was correct or not, it would be clear just by looking at the movements of the Great Xia army in Yusheng City. If the other party was really as he had imagined, then what they would do next was to disperse and sweep the wilderness. Then, they would combine to attack the city and repeat the cycle. What are you writing? Lin Xiaola asked while swaying on the back of the four-corned cow. She had been swaying and dozing off for 3 days, but she didn't fall. As for the reason, it was because she was completely tied to the back of the four-corned cow by the ropes. Renbaqian didn't know how useful such a tightly tied expert would be during an attack. He assumed that she didn't need to slowly untie the ropes. Otherwise, by the time she untied the ropes, his bones would have already turned into ashes. Some conjectures, Renbaqian said as he closed his notebook. Oh! After hearing what he said, Lin Xiaola couldn't be bothered to ask further. There are no more candies. Lin Xiaola said expectantly. Don't look for me when you have a toothache. Renbaqian took out a pack of white rabbit creamy candies from the backpack on the four-corned cow and threw it to Lin Xiaola. She immediately beamed with joy and squinted her eyes. The news spread very quickly. On the second day, there was news from the front lines that the Great Xia army that was attacking Yusheng City had split up and were advancing in different directions. After hearing this news, Renbaqian immediately knew that the other party was probably as he had guessed. Thus, he explained his conjecture of Great Xia's attack strategy through the radio. Sir Ren, what do you think is the possibility of this? Hong Wu's weak voice came from the radio. After eliminating all the impossible reasons, there is only one truth. Renbaqian adjusted his sunglasses. War isn't just about killing the enemy's strength. Destroying the enemy's economy and production is also an effective method. Furthermore, Great Xia doesn't only have these 80,000 soldiers. Don't forget that Great Xia still has 200,000 soldiers. It is entirely possible that a portion of them will converge with the Great Xia army outside Liao City while the other portion will continue to advance. Cough cough. Protector General Li, what do you think? Hong Wu asked. I think it's possible, Li Qianqiu said after remaining silent for a while. I also think it's possible, Hong Wu said softly. In Liao City, the Empress listened to the contents of the radio. She gently tapped the armrest of her chair with her fingers and asked faintly, What do you think? Hong Wu and Li Qianqiu frowned and thought hard. I have an idea, Renbaqian immediately said. Speak. The Empress nodded even though Renbaqian couldn't see her movements. In addition to the few cities that are currently embroiled in the flames of war, there are 16 other cities north of Lan City that are defended by 4,600 soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center. What if he mobilized these 4,600 soldiers? Given the current situation in each city, it will be very difficult for them to resist the attack of the Great Xia army. They can only delay for some time. Since this is the case, why don't we transfer these soldiers to one place? Instead, it will cause more trouble for them. Otherwise, even if 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South arrive, it will be very difficult to stop over 80,000 Great Xia soldiers and those practitioners from the martial arts world. In that case, the area north of Lan City will be completely defenseless. The other party doesn't need to unite their troops and just needs to attack separately. Hong Wu shook his head slightly and felt that Renbaqian's idea was too simple. We can set up a militia regiment. In the past, the military was affected by ordnance and rations. Now, the problem of ordnance has been solved. As for rations, during wartime, every Aboriginal should contribute to defend their homeland. Furthermore, they can also receive a steel saber as a weapon. I believe that many people will be interested in it. At that time, the meritorious deeds during the war will be recorded and the rewards will be distributed after the war. Tell me in detail. The Empress's interest was piqued. The term militia regiment was refreshing to her. Chapter 347. The Aboriginal commoners aren't weak. As long as they reach adulthood and train a little, they can attain the strength of a Great Xia man-wheel expert and become a low-level officer in Great Xia. They don't lack courage. This can be seen from the fact that a large number of commoners in Yusheng City and Liao City resisted and defended their cities in times of crisis. What they lack is just weapons, training to coordinate with them, and someone to organize them. Although war is the business of soldiers, at this moment, when the army can't protect them, they need to protect themselves. Although there will be casualties, it's still better than the current situation. As long as a small number of elite soldiers are used as the backbone and the commoners are used as flesh and blood. For example, a team of 10 people, 1 elite soldier and 9 commoners, can form a fairly strong army in a short period of time. Furthermore, if we need to replenish the army, they can form a fighting force faster than recruits from the mountains. This is feasible, Hongwu said after a long silence. Although he didn't like to push commoners onto the battlefield, he had to think of a way to reverse the situation. Otherwise, if he allowed that army to wreak havoc in the hinterland of Daeyo, even if they were driven away, it would take a long time for them to recover. Not to mention the 200,000 reinforcements from Great Xia. As long as 100,000 reinforcements joined with the 70,000 soldiers outside Liao City, they would be able to stall the winged cavalry and the soldiers from the protectorate of the center in Liao City. If the 100,000 reinforcements also entered the hinterland of Daeyo, there would be more than 180,000 reinforcements. Even if the 5,000 reinforcements from the protectorate of the south arrived, it was very likely that they would be swallowed by them. If that happened, the situation would be even more difficult. As long as this system is implemented, they can focus on their own lives in the future and gather together during the war. This way, we don't need to consume too much rations and can mobilize an army of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands within a short period of time. Great Elder, call Qin Chuan over to discuss this issue together, the Empress ordered. There is another problem, which is the 2 armies that entered Daeyo. Since they are replenishing their rations on the spot, we can completely fortify the walls and clear the fields. We can inform all the people in the strongholds to take away all the edible food and gather them in the cities, leaving them with nothing in the wilderness. If the cities are breached, evacuate the people in the cities and destroy all the rations that can't be brought away. If they wanted to replenish their rations on the spot, then they would be left empty-handed. They could only retreat or rely on Great Xia to replenish their rations. If it's the former, we can cut off their path of retreat and swallow them whole. If it's the latter, we can cut off their rations, force them to retreat, and then block their way back, Rinpoche continued. We don't have enough soldiers. Li Qianqiu's words made it clear that they were powerless at the moment. In the face of the aggressive Great Xia, Daeyo fell into a passive position in a short period of time. If the 16 towns to the north of Lan City were to be implemented according to the method just now, we would be able to deploy at least 3,000 soldiers. Although more than half of the soldiers to the south of Lan City have been deployed, we should still be able to assemble 1,500 soldiers, right? Together with the 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South, they would be able to make up a total of 9,500 soldiers. Furthermore, even though the Empress's winged cavalry seem to be delayed in Liao City, they could be dispatched at any time. At that time, they would be able to take down one of the 2 armies. We have a radio station so we can communicate with each other at any time, but they can't. At the mention of the radio station, everyone felt a little more relaxed. This was currently their greatest advantage over Great Xia. Furthermore, why don't we change our method of battle? We have fewer people than them, and our 8,000 soldiers have the combat power of their 80,000 soldiers. In terms of flexibility, we are also much better than them. Furthermore, many of them were born in the mountains and are good at archery. We can circle around them and harass them with bows and arrows at all times. After a wave of attacks, we will retreat. Unless the enemy is cavalry, they won't be able to catch up to us. We can directly annihilate a small number of cavalry soldiers, Rinpoche continued. Even though our soldiers have stronger arm strength than the Great Xia soldiers, in terms of archery, we are inferior to Daeyo. As a result, the shooting range of both sides is very close. When our soldiers are able to use bows and arrows to attack the enemy, they are also exposed to the enemy's arrows at the same time. In every battle, our losses are the greatest during this period. On the contrary, when both sides engage in close combat with real swords and spears, the losses will be much smaller, Hongwu answered Rinpoche's question. It's not that we don't have a solution. We just need to move quickly. The Great Xia army is bloated, and they are much less flexible than us. Rinpoche pondered for a while and thought about the army of Genghis Khan. Even though the aboriginals relied on their 2 legs, their running speed wasn't very fast. But when we reach the vicinity of the Great Xia army, they have already discovered us. Hongwu insisted on his own opinion on this matter. Rinpoche didn't refute him anymore. In this aspect, Hongwu knew more than him. It was better for him to stay at the front line for a period of time before deciding. Following which, everyone discussed the issue of strengthening the militia and clearing the fields for a long time. Rinpoche really wanted to name the militia the City Management Brigade. Just this name alone would provide a 30% increase in combat power. Unfortunately, the Empress's veto power directly rejected this idea. Although strengthening the defenses and clearing the fields was currently the right method, the people of Dayo felt a little heartache at the thought of destroying crops that hadn't even matured yet. After this battle, everyone in Dayo would probably have to tighten their bellies. Don't worry about the food. It will be fine as long as the sweet potatoes are ripe. Furthermore, Great Xia doesn't lack food, Rinpoche comforted everyone. As long as the current Great Xia army was crippled, the situation between the 2 sides would be reversed. Great Xia's land would be free to be used as they pleased. After the agreement was made over the radio, the Ministry of War immediately started to work on the militia. Large quantities of weapons that were originally intended to be used to equip the new recruits were transferred to the various towns in the north of Lan City. Shi Qing also ordered the various towns to gather the commoners in the nearby strongholds. Those that could be brought along would be brought along, and those that couldn't be brought along would be destroyed. The entire north of Dayo was in motion. On the other hand, Rinpoche continued his journey northeast. After traveling for a day, he rested for the night in a stronghold. "Sir, how's the situation now?" Early in the morning, the chief looked at Rinpoche and the rest who were preparing to eat and asked. The commoners didn't understand the current situation of the war, but they had heard that a city in the north had already been destroyed by the Great Xia army. The order will be issued soon. All the strongholds will gather the food and enter the nearest town. Those that can be brought along will be brought along, and those that can't be brought along will be destroyed. Even if the chief didn't ask, he still had to say it. This place was already too close to the front line. "How can we do that?" The chief was shocked. At present, the vegetables in the fields would be ripe in another half a month. At that time, a portion would be used for their own use and a portion would be sold in the city in exchange for meat. This would be enough to cover nearly half of their rations. As for the other half, it would be the water buffaloes and other livestock that were raised in the stronghold. If they were to lose half of their rations, they would probably have a hard time in the future. The Great Xia army will be here soon. These rations will not be destroyed because they are prepared for them. Withdraw to the city, and the imperial court will make arrangements for them, Rinpoche said faintly. At this moment, they suddenly heard a clamor coming from the entrance of the stronghold. "Sir, it's the Great Xia army." Shi Hu's face darkened after listening attentively. Rinpoche tilted his head. "You guys run faster than Chow Chow." Chapter 348. Bring me my big gun. Rinpoche gestured to the side. Immediately, someone brought the 2.15-meter anti-aircraft machine gun over, and Rinpoche grabbed it. "Bring the ammo box too." Rinpoche called out again. Then he stepped forward and walked toward the entrance of the village. Shi Hu hurriedly followed behind him. "Wake up the one who's still sleeping," Rinpoche said without turning his head. At critical moments, Lin Chala was still more reliable. It was not that Shi Hu and the others were unreliable, but their strength was slightly too low. In any case, Lin Chala was the bodyguard that the Empress found for Rinpoche. The Empress should have a good understanding of her strength. When they arrived at the entrance of the stronghold, the main gate of the stronghold was being pulled shut. It was a little chaotic here. Some people were blocking the gate while others were looking for weapons. It was a mess. "Who are you? How many are there?" Shi Hu caught a person and asked. "It's the Great Xia army. There are at least a few thousand of them," the person who was caught said anxiously. Ren Baqien went up to the corner tower of the stronghold and looked out. He saw a long line of soldiers advancing toward the stronghold from afar. The front line was at least a few kilometers away from the stronghold, and a lot of dust was kicked up behind them like a yellow dragon. Can you tell how many there are? Ren Baqien asked Sherhu. Following which, he said to the people behind him, "Bring me all the ammunition boxes and my bag." Then, he opened the two boxes and connected the ammunition chains together. Judging from the amount of dust they kicked up, there are at least 3,000 to 4,000 people, Sherhu said after a long time of silent calculation. Ren Baqien nodded and waited there. There were more than 300 old and weak people in the stockade village, and close to 200 young and strong people. In fact, aboriginals in their 50s could be considered young and strong. At the very least, their combat power wasn't bad. Furthermore, these people were barely able to defend against 1,000 Great Xia soldiers, let alone a few thousand enemy soldiers. After all, even though these people weren't weak, they were only a bunch of slightly stronger villagers compared to the elite Great Xia soldiers who lacked swords and sabers. Even if they had the strength of a man-will expert, they were just a bunch of slightly stronger villagers. "Milord, should we retreat? Even if we bring the people from the stronghold with us, as long as they don't have any cavalry, they won't be able to catch up to us," Sherhu said in a low voice. "Retreat? Great luck, and we'll be eating chicken later." Ren Baqien glanced at him. "Today, my great spear is finally going to be used, and you're telling me to retreat?" After thinking for a while, Ren Baqien said, "Let the old and weak in the stronghold evacuate first. Don't bring anything with you. If we really can't hold on any longer, we'll retreat." While they were talking, Ren Baqien's backpack and 20 ammunition belts were sent to the corner tower. The other wooden boxes were also piled up below. Ren Baqien took out a pair of binoculars from his bag. Through the binoculars, he was able to see more clearly and could even see the faces of the people in front. 4 people in a row were advancing in this direction with spears in their hands. It was impossible to tell how long it was. However, Ren Baqien saw the shadows of horses. Fortunately, there weren't many of them. "Let the old and the weak retreat. If they stay here, it will be troublesome if they really have to escape," Ren Baqien urged Sherhu. Sherhu glanced at the spear that Ren Baqien had set up. Even though he had seen the power of this thing that day, he wasn't sure if it could stop the Great Xia army. There were too many of them. If things didn't turn out well, they would let that girl take Sir Ren away first. No matter what, they would be able to hold them back for a while. At the thought of this, he went to make arrangements. Not long after, the old and the weak in the village, accompanied by dozens of strong young men, left the back of the village and headed straight for Shaojiang City, which was half a day's journey away. The front line of the Great Xia army arrived at a place 500 meters away from the village and stopped, waiting for the people behind them to arrive. "Do you really want to stop them here?" Lin Xiaola finally came to her senses at this moment. She leaned against the wall of the corner tower and spoke unhurriedly. "I will fight to the death and not retreat." Ren Baqien grinned, revealing a set of ghastly white teeth. Lin Xiaola looked at him suspiciously. When did he become so strong-willed? "How is it? Am I strong-willed?" Ren Baqien laughed mischievously. "Strong-willed? Just don't shout for help later." Lin Xiaola threw a piece of white rabbit creamy candy into her mouth and carefully counted the amount of white rabbit creamy candy in her sachet. Every time she ate a piece, she would count it again. It might have something to do with her math teacher's early death, and she was afraid that she would lose the sweets. Ren Baqien turned his head and shouted, "Leave 2 people behind to help me reload the ammunition belts. The rest of you, stay in your respective positions. Each guard will be assigned to 3 able-bodied young men." At this moment, there were 3 assembled ammunition belts on the ground. Each belt consisted of 5 ordinary ammunition belts connected together and contained 300 bullets. At the same time, there were also 300 bullets loaded into the gun. The Great Xia army outside didn't wait for everyone to arrive. When the first 1,000 soldiers arrived, they formed a battle formation and pressed toward the village. Even though the footsteps of 1,000 soldiers weren't uniform, Ren Baqien, who was on the corner tower, felt the ground tremble slightly. "Let them come closer, closer so that they won't run away later. Rinpoche used his eyes to aim through the scope, aimed the muzzle at the front of the battle formation, and muttered softly. To be honest, it would be a lie to say that he wasn't nervous at all. In front of him was a battle formation of 1,000 soldiers. Even though Rinpoche had a gun in his hand, he was still somewhat nervous. He wasn't the only one who was nervous. The others were nervous as well. Needless to say, the able-bodied young men were facing thousands of elite Great Xia soldiers even though they had tough temperaments. Under such circumstances, staying here was practically a dead end. It was already extremely courageous for them to stay here at this time. Among them, there was a reluctance to leave their homeland and the thought of stopping the old and weak from leaving first. They would leave when they really couldn't stop the Great Xia army anymore. This was what most of them were thinking. Their faces were tense as they stared at the Great Xia army in the distance and clenched the weapons in their hands. "Huzi, don't be lenient later," someone said to the young man beside him. "Watch me. I will smash their brains in a while," the young man said with a thick wooden stick in his hand. Not long after, he asked again, "Can we stop them?" "Why should we? There are thousands of them. We will try to delay them until they are far away and we can't stop them anymore. Then we will retreat," the strong man said. As for the other guards, they were already prepared to fight to the death and let Rinpoche escape. However, they still had some expectations in their hearts. They hoped that Rinpoche's weapon would really be able to stop the Great Xia army outside the village. They watched as the other party's long spears pointed diagonally forward and approached the village step by step. 4 to 5 arrows were shot into the Great Xia battle formation. Both sides hadn't communicated with each other since the beginning. Both the elite soldiers of Great Xia and the aboriginals in the village were silent. In the eyes of both sides, the other party wasn't only an enemy nation but also a foreign race. Only one side could survive. A few Great Xia soldiers were shot and immediately fell to the ground in silence. There was only a slight commotion in the battle formation before they stepped over the bodies of the few people on the ground. This kind of silence and the intensive footsteps made Rinpoche feel even more depressed. However, a smile appeared on his face. It was the same smile that he had when he was the Honglu deputy and asked Xiongpai to hang that guard from the Lien family. It was a very kind smile, but it concealed everything in his heart, making it impossible for others to know what he was thinking. Bang, bang, bang. Rinpoche pressed the trigger and the muzzle immediately spat out a half-meter-long flame. At this moment, the Great Xia battle formation was finally no longer silent. The moment the flame was spat out, it set off a wave of blood. Broken limbs flew everywhere, and many people fell to the ground without making a sound. However, there were still many people who had broken arms or legs and were screaming on the ground. A 12.7 mm bullet could almost break a person's waist when it hit the body. If it hit other parts of the body, broken limbs would fly everywhere. Furthermore, from Rinpoche's angle, if the first shot hit the chest of the person in front, the bullet would make a big hole in his chest and even break the legs of the person behind him. From the scope, he could clearly see that the flesh and blood of the Great Xia soldiers were splattered everywhere. Like wheat being reaped, they fell in rows with miserable screams. Fragments of internal organs spurted out from the wounds and scattered everywhere. Most people didn't know what had happened before they realized that a piece of their body was missing. Chapter 349. Bang, 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 bang. A series of machine gun sounds resounded above the stronghold. This was the first time that this kind of weapon, which was very unfamiliar to this world, had brought about a result that made people shudder. Click, click. When the combination ammunition chain was emptied, Rinpoche threw it directly below the corner tower and said, "Reload." His hand didn't stop pressing the other combination ammunition chain onto the gun. He aimed at the Great Xia soldiers who were at a loss after discovering that the people in front of them had fallen to the ground in pieces and pulled the trigger again. The captain of the Great Xia army looked at the people at the front of the line who had fallen into a pool of blood. He listened to the miserable howls of the Great Xia soldiers whose limbs were broken or who had a big hole in their abdomen. He originally thought that an aboriginal village would only cause a little trouble at most, even if it wasn't as easy as falling to a rock under the attack of 1,000 elite soldiers. That was what he was thinking a minute ago. He didn't expect that a corner tower in the stockade would suddenly spit out a tongue of flame, accompanied by a clear and strange sound. Then, the soldiers in front of him fell down like straws. A quarter of the 200 elite soldiers were turned into a sea of blood and minced meat. This wave of attack was too sudden, and the method of attack was completely unfamiliar. Until now, he still didn't know what exactly the other party was using. Whether it was in terms of power or speed, it was much more powerful than an arrow. It was so powerful that it terrified him, and he couldn't help but reveal a panicked expression. If this went on, he was afraid that these 1,000 elite soldiers would all fall to the ground before they could even reach the walls of the stronghold. Although he shouted for a retreat, the great Xia soldiers were too densely packed. Rinpoche's second ammunition chain was emptied, and another half of the soldiers fell to the ground. At this moment, half of the 1,000 great Xia soldiers had already fallen to the ground. Reload! Rinpoche threw the ammunition chain below the corner tower without any expression on his face. At this moment, all his emotions had completely calmed down. His heart rate dropped from 160 to 70, and the bloody scene and the miserable howls outside the stronghold had been completely cast out of his mind. There was a saying that went, after watching all the action movies in the world, one would naturally have no code in his heart. Rinpoche did the opposite. After seeing so much blood, he would naturally have a code in his heart. Rinpoche felt that this was his realm. The loneliness of being an expert arose spontaneously. Who was the one who shouted for a retreat just now? Was it that person with a green feather on his hat? He was dressed like a military officer. As Rinpoche thought about it, he aimed and pulled the trigger. The great Xia captain's body seemed to have been electrocuted. He magically twisted his body and actually dodged the bullet. Rinpoche's eyes widened. Your waist is as thick as a water bucket, yet you can twist your waist like a water snake? As expected of an expert. Da-da-da. Several large holes immediately appeared on the bodies of the two soldiers beside the captain. Rinpoche simply swept the muzzle of his gun horizontally and finally turned that great Xia officer into a pile of mosaic. Rinpoche then turned the muzzle to the great Xia soldiers who were fleeing in all directions. It was a bit of a waste just now. 600 bullets killed or maimed 500 people. Given the density of the great Xia army, a considerable number of them killed or maimed 2 people at a time. Based on this calculation, the hit rate was at most 50%. What's more, this was when the enemy was so densely packed. This time, Rinpoche slowed down a lot. The almost non-stop gunshots were reduced to 2 or 3 short gunshots. Those guards watched as Great Xia's battle formation closed in. They watched as the strange weapon emitted a sound and the Great Xia battle formation was set off in a rain of blood. They watched as the Great Xia soldiers fell in rows and the Great Xia army, which originally had an imposing aura, scattered in confusion. Everyone was dumbfounded. They looked at the Great Xia army and then looked at the flaming tongues from the other corner tower. They looked as if they were looking at a god. All the nervousness and apprehension from before had completely disappeared. Rinpoche stopped pulling the trigger. About 100 people ran away from the enemy with 4 ammunition belts. In the end, some of them even evolved to run in an S-shaped pattern, which made Rinpoche exclaim in admiration. He had brought a total of 5,000 rounds of ammunition. This kind of bullet was too heavy. One bullet weighed 131 grams, which was a little more than 2.5 ounces. 4 of these bullets weighed about half a kilogram. Including the box, he could only bring more than 2,000 rounds at a time. After firing these 4 ammunition belts, there were less than 4,000 rounds left. It was better to use them sparingly. As such, he couldn't be bothered to shoot those who ran too far away. Even though the effective range of this gun was more than 1,000 meters, Rinpoche was very confident in his marksmanship. It wasn't worth it to waste too many bullets on those few people. Outside the stronghold, there were corpses and flesh scattered all over the ground. The area closest to the stronghold was the most concentrated, and the further away it was, the more scattered it was. How lonely it is to be invincible. How empty it is to be invincible. Standing alone at the peak, the cold wind blows continuously. My loneliness. Who can understand me? Rinpoche hummed a tune as he picked up the binoculars and looked at the Great Xia army that was 1 kilometer away. He saw a few people standing in front of the Great Xia army and looking in his direction. The 100 Great Xia soldiers who ran back to save their lives were telling them something. Following which, Rinpoche used the binoculars to look to the side. His eyes suddenly froze. What was that? That black cylinder that was being pulled by a carriage, a cannon! Rinpoche exclaimed. There was actually such a thing in the Great Xia army? Lin Xiaola, who had been staring at the anti-aircraft machine gun, finally regained her senses. What cannon? Rinpoche pointed in the direction of the Great Xia army. He opened his mouth and didn't say anything for a long time. The Great Xia army actually had cannons? This was too much of a surprise. He never thought that he would actually see such a thing in this world. However, as he continued to observe, he realized that the cannons of the Great Xia army should be very primitive, like the early iron cannons from the Yuan and Ming dynasties. They were very clumsy and didn't have much power. However, he would only know the specifics after obtaining them. Rinpoche frowned. He felt that it was necessary for him to bring his Italian cannon over. If Great Xia took out something else, he wouldn't feel anything. However, they actually took out cannons. Rinpoche felt that he was being provoked. Sir Ren, this is really too powerful. Shi Hu hurriedly ran to the corner tower and exclaimed. Although he already knew that this thing wasn't weak, he didn't expect it to be so terrifying. Especially in the face of a military formation. Rinpoche grunted twice. He had to maintain the demeanor of an expert. He then continued to use the binoculars to look at the other side. There were a few people who looked like generals standing in front of the army and pointing at them. Many of them were frowning, showing either fear or anger. One of them was particularly eye-catching. The silver helmet on his head was shining brightly. Rinpoche felt that he would be going against his conscience if he didn't shoot him. If he killed the other party's general, would the other party retreat? Even if he had to waste more bullets to kill the other party, it would be worth it. Needless to say, the other party's generals actually gathered together. At the thought of this, Rinpoche gently moved the muzzle to aim at the other party and then held the trigger. Through the scope, the general wearing the silver helmet revealed an astonished look. Soon after, a long saber appeared in his hand and he waved it in the air. A few sparks flashed in the air, and the long saber in the general's hand turned into a pile of fragments. Then the general tried to dodge. However, the bullets from the machine gun were too dense and fast. The killing range of this gun on flat ground was 1,500 meters. At 1,000 meters, it still had considerable lethality. In addition, it could fire 6 rounds per second. The general wanted to dodge, but he was turned into a mist of blood. Chapter 350. In a short period of time, Rinpoche poured out a chain of bullets at the enemy, turning many of the Great Xia generals who were overlooking into the distance into a pile of mosaics. Previously, when Rinpoche was more than 700 meters away, he didn't fire again and let the 100 Great Xia soldiers run back. Everyone thought that Rinpoche's shooting range was limited to this. After all, with the strength of the soldiers in this world, even if the Great Xia soldiers were much stronger than the soldiers on Earth, they could only shoot at a distance of 300 to 400 steps with a longbow. Crossbow bolts only had a shooting range of about 100 steps, and the giant ballistae that guarded the city had a shooting range of 800 to 1,000 steps. The thunder cannon that Great Xia had just developed could reach a shooting range of 1,400 steps and was already regarded as a siege weapon. The weapon in Rinpoche's hands was so powerful that it was far better than a crossbow, and its attack speed was unbelievable. A shooting range of 1,400 steps was already extremely shocking. Many of the Great Xia generals were observing from a distance of 1 kilometer, which was 2,000 steps away. They were thinking about how to break into the stronghold, snatch the weapons from the enemy's hands, and send them back to the imperial court. However, they were all wiped out by Renbachin. The Great Xia army was in a state of chaos, especially the guards. In Great Xia, if the generals died and the guards were fine, the guards would be executed. Therefore, as long as the general died, the guards would definitely be killed. The guards were usually treated much better than ordinary soldiers, but they were bound together by the general's rise and fall. As a result, they were usually extremely loyal. Even if they died, the general would still take care of their family members and provide financial compensation. However, if the general died, the guards wouldn't be able to live either. At this moment, the captain and a few captains were wiped out, and the guards were all stunned. Following which, they bellowed that they wanted to avenge the captain. The chaos spread from the front to the back of the army. Renbachin used his binoculars to see that the enemy's army was in chaos. First, some people shouted something, and then nearly 1/3 of the army rushed toward the stronghold. Even the cannons that were being driven by the carriages were brought up by them. The others were at a loss and didn't know what to do. Very brave. Renbachin was in awe. It was better for such a brave enemy to die. However, he didn't know that by wiping out those people just now, he had killed many of them. This Great Xia army was actually a regiment with a total of 4,600 soldiers in 5 battalions. According to military strength, it was equivalent to a military headquarters. Among them, from the highest-ranking commandant to the commandant of each battalion, there were at least a few hundred bodyguards. In addition to those who had been incited, there were more than 1,000 people rushing over. Renbachin unhurriedly used the scope to take aim at the people one by one. On the battlefield, some of the people who were running around suddenly lost a section of their body or broke into two. Then, they bounced up some dust on the ground near them. Such a scene was terrifying, but it also made them even crazier. However, their craziness was only rewarded with faster shooting by Renbachin. Occasionally, there were a few soldiers who slipped through the net, but he didn't bother about them. There were so many guards around, and 50 earthwheel level guards were enough to kill these Great Xia soldiers. Therefore, after killing and shooting half of the Great Xia soldiers, he no longer paid any attention to them. He gave an order to the guards beside him, and the guards in the stronghold jumped down from the wall, drew their steel swords, and faced the heroic Great Xia soldiers. Battle cries immediately rang out from the surroundings. Some of the villagers in the stronghold were envious. They simply picked up their clubs and rushed out. Halfway through, they threw their clubs away and went to the ground to pick up their weapons. They carried a bundle of spears that were scattered on the ground back to the stronghold. When they returned, they would look for a blacksmith to smelt the spear tips and forge them into long swords. All of them were smiling like sunflowers. He only used the scope to look at the desperate soldiers who were stuffing explosives into the cannons. After seeing them stuffing a stone shell into the cannon, Renbachin opened fire and killed those soldiers. He didn't need them to light the fire as he could do it himself. Renbachin fired a machine gun at those Great Xia soldiers who didn't know whether to advance or retreat. This was much more effective than serving tea and seeing them off. The battle outside the stronghold was also coming to an end. Shi Hu and the other guards were covered in blood. They kicked the corpses that were blocking their way to the side, hugged their arms, and looked at the fleeing Great Xia soldiers with a heroic look on their faces. Renbachin left the spear there and asked someone to call Shi Hu back to look at his precious spear. He then brought Lin Xiaola and a few guards to check on the 2 cannons. By the time he reached the place where he had fallen, the Great Xia soldiers were already nowhere to be seen. "Sir, do you know what this is?" a few guards asked curiously when they saw Renbachin hurriedly looking at the iron pipe. "Cannons." Renbachin replied casually and examined it carefully. The cannon looked a little ugly. It had a flared mouth at the front and a rather thick belly at the back. Renbachin didn't know the purpose of this design. It was about 1.6 meters long, completely made of iron, and had a dark body. It was estimated to weigh more than 500 kilograms. Without weighing it, Renbachin didn't know the specifics. He took out the stone shell and found that it had a diameter of about 110 millimeters. After stuffing the stone shell back into the cannon, Renbachin found a direction. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand and ignited the cannon with the other. He was ready to see how far this cannon could shoot. Boom! The body of the cannon shook violently. Even the cannon and its wheels were pushed back by the recoil. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder. However, the smell of gunpowder wasn't quite the same as when Rinpoche fired the gun. There was actually a little peach smell, which made Rinpoche feel a little baffled. Only God knew what the Great Xia people added to the gunpowder. Go, find out where the shell was shot to. If you can find any traces, that will do. Rinpoche pointed to the front. More than a dozen guards seemed to have broken free from their reins and ran out. This seems to be similar to yours? Lin Xiaola asked. Much worse. Rinpoche had a look of disdain on his face. How dare you compare my precious spear to this thing? Even though there wasn't much of a difference in theory, in reality, there was a difference of at least a few hundred years of development. If Great Xia was allowed to research cannons, it was hard to say whether they could reach the modern stage in another 1,000 years. By that time, Dayo would probably be able to use the Star Destroyer cannon. Very soon, those guards found the traces of the falling stone. Rinpoche followed them to take a look. He calculated in his heart that it was about 1,200 steps, which was about 600 meters. He reckoned that this thing couldn't exceed 800 meters at most. Even though it wasn't much in Rinpoche's eyes, it was already considered pretty good in this era. After all, the catapult had a range of about 400 steps, which was equivalent to 200 meters. Furthermore, the catapult was clumsier and required more manpower when it was used. This thing only needed a few people. Even though the power of this thing wasn't very great and it was impossible to use it to destroy a fortified city, it was extremely easy to use it to attack a stronghold in the wilderness. That kind of stronghold with wooden fences was completely unable to block this kind of stone shell. Furthermore, the stone shell had already been invented. Presumably, Great Xia would soon discover that the iron shell was more powerful. Perhaps Great Xia had already discovered it, but for some reason, they hadn't used it yet. By the time Rinpoche got the guards to bring the two cannons back to the stronghold, the other weapons had already been collected by the villagers. Sir. The villagers held a few long sabers in both hands and gave them to Rinpoche. This isn't bad. Rinpoche picked the prettiest one from the bunch. It was quite heavy and weighed at least 10 kilograms. Rinpoche casually twirled the saber, and the face of the guard beside him turned green. He watched as the tip of the saber whizzed through the air in front of his eyes. Goosebumps appeared all over his body, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly retreated a few meters away. He made up his mind that if Rinpoche was holding a weapon, he would never approach him again. Sir, what should we do with these weapons? The guard asked. The villagers looked at Rinpoche anxiously. These spears had become treasures in their eyes. The spearheads of about 2,000 spears were enough to forge 100 long sabers. To these villagers, this was a huge sum of money. They are all yours. Rinpoche could tell what they were thinking and waved his hand. In the past, Dayo lacked iron, but now, it wasn't so much. Furthermore, as time passed, the number of weapons in Dayo would increase. In another year, these iron weapons wouldn't be so unattainable to these villagers. Thank you, sir. The villagers were ecstatic upon hearing this. Send this to the nearest town and ask them to send someone to deliver it to the Ministry of Works. I will write a letter in a while, Rinpoche said to the villagers while pointing at the cannon. Yes, sir. After receiving the spears, the villagers looked at Rinpoche cordially. Not to mention that Rinpoche had saved their village previously. They naturally agreed to such a small matter. Rinpoche then turned on the radio station and found that Shi Qing was online. He felt that Shi Qing was doing nothing but guarding the radio station every day, just like a customer service agent for Taobao. Rinpoche told him about what happened here, and Shi Qing was shocked. Rinpoche actually encountered the Great Xia army again? This news was simply frightening. Sir Ren, can you stop scaring us? If anything happens to you, Her Majesty will definitely go crazy. Shi Qing couldn't help but tactfully say, Sir Ren, as long as you are safe and don't run around, that will be the greatest help to the current war. As for the matter of intercepting the Great Xia army, there are tens of thousands of aboriginal warriors, so you don't have to worry about it. However, the news that Rinpoche received next made him feel a little incredulous. He led dozens of guards to repel thousands of Great Xia soldiers, and he wasn't injured at all? How was this possible? 1 against 100, even if they were Earthwheel-level guards, they would probably suffer heavy casualties, right? After all, the Great Xia army wasn't made of clay. Rinpoche didn't explain too much and only asked them to quickly inform all the villages in the north of Lan City to immediately bring their rations back to the nearby towns and burn everything else. After that, he wrote a letter to the villagers and got the guards to pack up and get ready to set off. 2,000 people had died outside the village, and the land next year would presumably be very fertile. It was a pity that these villagers had to hide in the town. Presumably, the weeds here would be extremely lush in a few months. After Rinpoche left, the villagers brought 2,000 spears to the town. The story of the Empress's husband, Sir Ren, killing 2,000 Great Xia soldiers with a strange weapon began to spread in the town. Subsequently, it became 5,000, 8,000, and 20,000. Chapter 351. Sir, they are scouts from Great Xia. When Rinpoche was still half a day away from Liao City, he could see Great Xia scouts sizing them up from afar. When they were about 500 to 600 meters away, they turned their horses around and left. Pay attention at all times, Rinpoche said while caressing the machine gun on the fork-horned cow. Wake up the one who is still sleeping and untie her. Now, Rinpoche was starting to doubt whether Lin Xiaola was protecting him or him. Along the way, Lin Xiaola basically tied a rope to the fork-horned cow to sleep. It seemed that this was the most important and happiest thing for her. Following which, everyone raised their vigilance to prevent the Great Xia soldiers from suddenly charging over and surrounding them. When they were still a few kilometers away from Liao City, Rinpoche could already see the city gate open. A group of goat riders came bouncing out of Liao City and welcomed Rinpoche's team. At this moment, Rinpoche could already see the Great Xia barracks in the distance. It was just outside the east gate of Liao City. Yesterday, the reinforcements from Great Xia arrived. Just as Rinpoche had expected, there were only 100,000 of them. They joined up with the 70,000 soldiers from before and once again surrounded the east, west, and north gates of Liao City. They didn't care about those who were heading south. It seemed like they were going all out to isolate Tiesua Pass and Shun City from Deyo. However, it was hard to say what their intentions were. How's the situation in the city? Rinpoche asked the winged cavalry. Everything is normal. The winged cavalry didn't look too serious. Even though 170,000 Great Xia soldiers were outside the city, they weren't too nervous. Rinpoche nodded. He looked up at the red dot on the city gate tower and felt a little excited. However, before everyone reached the city gate, they heard the sound of cannons coming from afar. Then, there was an earth-shattering battle cry. Are they attacking the city? Rinpoche immediately reacted. In the morning, when he contacted the Empress through the radio station, he didn't hear any news of the Great Xia army attacking the city. It seemed like the Great Xia army was ready. Enter the city. Rinpoche looked up and saw that the figure on the city wall had already disappeared. Everyone urged their oxen to gallop while being protected by a group of goat riders. Even though they had seen this many times and there were battle cries coming from afar, Rinpoche still couldn't help but laugh at such a grim situation. Damn, it was too funny. Even the filmmakers wouldn't dare to make up such a story. A group of experts with sturdy physiques, as if they had come from a sheep village, sat down. They were Happy Goat, Lazy Goat, and Beautiful Goat. The murderous aura disappeared in an instant. The city gate wasn't closed from the beginning to the end, and no one came to stop Rinpoche and the others. It was only after everyone entered the city that the gate slowly closed. Although 3 sides had launched attacks on the city, the people in the city did not panic. However, many people walked out of their houses and stood on the streets, looking in the direction of the battle cries in the distance. All of them had fierce expressions. The defense of the city during the few days before the Empress's arrival had completely aroused the hot-bloodedness in the hearts of these commoners. Now that the Empress was still in the city, these commoners couldn't wait to go up the city and kill the enemy. When they saw Rinpochen and his entourage coming in, they took a few more glances at them. They sized up Rinpochen, who was in the crowd, and examined the husband that the Empress had chosen. The group arrived at the city commander's mansion. The city magistrate was the official in charge of the city and the surrounding villages. Dayo was considered vast but sparsely populated. There were a total of 175 cities and towns, including 93 cities and towns where the remnant citizens of the Hao nation resided. In fact, there were only 82 Aboriginal cities and towns. Many Aboriginals who lived on the plains lived around the villages. Rinpochen jumped down from the fork-horned cow and hurriedly walked in. When he reached the main hall, he saw the Empress sitting on a chair with Qing Yuan and Hong Luan standing behind her. Below her were some generals wearing leather armor. "Your Majesty!" Rinpochen stepped forward to greet her. The Empress let out a grunt in response. "Everyone, go ahead and do your own things. Li Qianqiu, follow me to the city wall to take a look," the Empress said faintly. Everyone glanced at Rinpochen and filed out. Rinpochen raised his head and looked at the person who stayed behind. He was a burly man who was 2 meters tall and looked like an iron tower. His entire body was bronze in color, and he looked fierce and intimidating. "You follow me as well." The Empress pointed at Rinpochen. "Yes." Rinpochen didn't expect to see a reunion after a long separation. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. After greeting her, he followed the Empress up the city wall. "Principal Ren." Li Qianqiu grinned at Rinpochen, revealing a sinister smile that made people feel that it was more threatening than kind. Since the outbreak of the war, Rinpochen had done a lot of things, including the radio station that everyone used as a chat group. This was the first time that everyone knew that there was such a way to communicate, and they treated it like a treasure. There was also the salt, iron, weaponsmithing, and the proposal to strengthen the city wall and clear the fields and the militia. Rinpochen's importance in the hearts of the court officials had risen sharply. Li Qianqiu showed kindness to him as soon as they met. "Greetings, Sir Li." Rinpochen cupped his hands and smiled. Before they reached the city wall, they heard a whistling sound in the air, followed by the loud sound of a heavy object smashing against the city wall. Looking out from the top of the city wall, they saw a few catapults 200 meters away. There were 2 wooden planks on both sides of the catapults to block arrows. Rows of soldiers were carrying huge stones and loading them onto the catapults. From time to time, a few bone arrows would be shot over, and someone would groan and fall to the ground. Even though Great Xia's cannons had a long range, their power was too small and couldn't deal with a fortified city. Even though the catapults had a short range, the stones they threw caused more damage to the city wall. When Rinpochen saw the Empress looking into the distance, he handed over the binoculars hanging in front of his chest and received a look of admiration. When he turned his head, he found that Li Qianqiu was looking into the distance with a pair of binoculars. He was the only one who was empty-handed. After a while, he took the binoculars from the Empress and looked into the distance. Behind the catapults were rows of solemn soldiers. The first row of soldiers held shiny silver shields, while the second row of soldiers held a huge box in their hands. The next 3 rows of soldiers were holding bows and arrows, and the soldiers at the back were pointing their spears into the sky like a dense forest. In the distance was a continuous stretch of barracks that seemed to have no boundaries. There were even rows of fences erected outside the barracks. Not long after, he put down the binoculars and took a deep breath. Even though he had seen an army before, he had never felt such an oppressive feeling. Sure enough, a quantitative change caused a qualitative change. There were at least 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers outside. When he looked through the binoculars just now, he saw that the other party was building some huge military equipment outside the barracks. It seemed like the catapults were just the appetizer. After looking through the binoculars, Li Qianqiu cupped his hands at the Empress and said, "Your Majesty, they are waiting for us to go out and destroy the equipment." The second row of the Great Xia army is the Godly Arms Battalion, followed by the archers. If we want to destroy those catapults, I'm afraid that many people will be injured. While they were talking, the catapults threw another round of huge stones. A few stones that weighed about half a ton smashed into the city wall one after another, causing the entire city wall to shake. It felt as if the city wall would collapse at any time. There were also 2 stones that went over the city wall and smashed into the city. A few houses near the city wall were immediately smashed into pieces. Fortunately, the people there had already been evacuated, so there were no casualties. The Empress stretched out her hand and said, "Give me the bow." Immediately, someone handed a longbow to the Empress. She nocked an arrow and shot it. One of the wooden beams on the catapult was immediately broken, but very quickly, a few soldiers went up to repair it with a piece of wood. "Your Majesty, we have to destroy at least half of it. Otherwise, they will be able to repair it very quickly," Li Qianqiu said. Following which, the 3 of them looked at the other 2 directions along the city wall, and it was almost the same. Only the south side of the city was unattacked. However, the great Xia soldiers from the east and west sides had scattered a large area of caltrops near the south side. There was also a row of Godly Arms Battalion soldiers holding crossbows to prevent Deyo from launching a surprise attack from the south gate. "What do you think about those catapults?" the Empress casually asked while they were on the city wall. "This matter is simple. Your Majesty, let them experience it in a while," Ren Baqian immediately replied. The Empress nodded her head. Chapter 352. Please wait a moment, Your Majesty. After descending the city wall, Ren Baqian slipped into the city commander's residence and stroked his spear. Then he carried another box out of the city commander's residence and asked the guards to help him carry it back to the vicinity of the city wall. The Empress and Li Qianqiu were waiting under the protection of a group of winged cavalry warriors. When they saw the guards carrying the box behind Ren Baqian, they began to guess what was inside. Ren Baqian asked the guard to open the box, revealing rows of black tubes. It wasn't big, only about the length of a palm and about an inch in diameter. "Principal Ren, what is this?" Li Qianqiu asked curiously as he picked up a stick and fiddled with it. "Explosives." Ren Baqian smiled. This batch of explosives was obtained from the place where he bought guns on Earth. It was divided into 2 layers. The middle layer contained 300 grams of TNT, and the outer layer contained gunpowder. When the gunpowder exploded, the TNT would detonate. Originally, this thing was prepared to be used for mining. There were 300 of them, and this box was half of them. In the end, he didn't use it at all. He had brought it with him when he left Lan City, and it just so happened that he could use it now. Explosives. Li Qianqiu was puzzled. The Empress knew a little about explosives, but she didn't know how to use them. "You will know in a while." After Ren Baqian finished speaking, everyone went up the city wall again. Ren Baqian squatted down and tied the explosives to a few long arrows. Then he cut off a section of the fuse at the back of the explosives before looking up at Li Qianqiu and saying, "Sir Li, I will have to trouble you to find someone to shoot this under the enemy's catapult later." "Let me do it," Li Qianqiu said. In fact, to these aboriginal soldiers who had grown up hunting in the mountains, a distance of 200 meters wasn't something everyone could achieve. However, he also wanted to see what Ren Baqian had come up with. Ren Baqian had prepared a total of 22 catapults. The enemy only had a total of 20 catapults around Liao City. After he was ready, Ren Baqian handed the bow and arrow to Li Qianqiu. Before Li Qianqiu could say anything, the bow and arrow turned into a white line and pierced a catapult with a sharp sound. Ren Baqian. Li Qianqiu had an expectant look on his face. 10 seconds later he asked, "Why isn't there any reaction?" "It hasn't been lit yet." Ren Baqian was speechless. I forgot. Li Qianqiu laughed heartily. After laughing, he picked up another bow and arrow and placed it on his bow. Ren Baqian asked someone to bring a lit piece of wood to light the fuse and quickly said, "All right, release." The fuse was still 10 centimeters long. Logically speaking, it should not be a problem for more than 10 seconds. However, he was afraid that something would go wrong with the fuse. If it was a quick shooter, then he would be in big trouble. As soon as he finished speaking, Li Qianqiu's fingers loosened, and the bow and arrow once again pierced through the air, traversing a distance of 200 meters and nailing itself onto the catapult. Then, Li Qianqiu cast a probing look at Ren Baqian. Wait! Ren Baqian used a pair of binoculars to look in that direction. At this moment, he couldn't see clearly whether the fuse was still burning. However, it didn't take long before a loud boom was heard from the Great Xia army. Along with the sudden burst of flames, the catapults were instantly turned into fragments that flew in all directions. The fragments hit the iron shields at the front of the battle formation and produced a sound of collision. A few soldiers who were reloading around the catapults were sent flying by the blast of the explosion. Two of the soldiers who were close to the catapults were only left with some broken corpses scattered everywhere. Boom! Just as the Great Xia army was shocked by this sudden unforeseen event, another explosion occurred within their battle formation. This time, it was the unlit explosive tube that was blown into the Great Xia battle formation and exploded again. At least a dozen soldiers in a radius of more than 10 meters were sent flying by this explosion, and the soldiers within a radius of 5 meters were directly blown to pieces. Good stuff! Li Qianqiu exclaimed in delight when he saw this scene from the city wall. Use this box sparingly and use it specifically to deal with their siege equipment. Without the siege equipment, they probably can't do anything other than besiege the city. If we continue to waste time here, they will need to consume a large amount of food, Ren Baqian exhorted. He was afraid that Li Qianqiu would squander it as he pleased. With this thing, no matter how many people they send, they can only watch from below. Li Qianqiu laughed heartily and patted Ren Baqian's shoulder. Subsequently, he instructed a few guards to use the bone arrows according to the method just now. After witnessing the explosion within the Great Xia battle formation, these guards were very careful and immediately shot out the bone arrows as soon as they were lit. They were afraid that the arrows would explode in their hands. Every 1 or 2 minutes, they could see a burst of fire in front of the Great Xia battle formation and the sound of an explosion. In just a short while, the 6 catapults in the east of Lan City were turned into a pile of broken wood. Following which, a few explosions could be heard from the north of the city, followed by the east. In just a short while, all the catapults of the Great Xia army had been turned into broken wood along with hundreds of soldiers who were either killed by the explosives or injured by the broken wood. Look after this thing and take good care of it. If anything goes wrong, I will hold you responsible, Li Qianqiu said sternly to the guards behind him. Don't worry, Protector General. Don't let it come into contact with an open flame or bump into it. You must store it carefully. Place it in a cool and dry place, and remember not to come into contact with fire. Ren Baqian exhorted repeatedly. Earthlings knew the danger of this thing and that it couldn't come into contact with fire, but he was still a little worried about the people of Deiyou. If these things exploded, he estimated that a quarter of Liao City would be destroyed. Sir, don't worry. The guards behind him cupped their hands. With these catapults destroyed, Great Xia probably wouldn't launch another attack today. Li Qianqiu continued to stay on the city wall to inspect while Ren Baqian followed the empress back to the city commander's residence. On the way back, Ren Baqian opened his eyes wide and spoke nonsense. Her Majesty has lost some weight. The empress wasn't an ordinary person, so her body naturally wouldn't become fat or skinny just because she ate more or less. The empress, on the other hand, was very pleased and lightly glanced at him. The guards behind him looked up at the sky and pretended that they didn't hear anything. In the north of Liao City, in a large tent behind the tens of thousands of soldiers, a general with hair and beard was standing in front of a table, looking at the map on it. From time to time, he would make gestures on it. Great General! A middle-aged man who looked like a scholar came in from outside the tent and cupped his hands. In the tent was the commander of the 700,000-strong army, the champion general, Marquis Wuxing Jinling. His reputation among the people of Great Xia was far inferior to that of Hongwu in Deiyou. This was also because Great Xia hadn't made any progress in the south for 70 years. In fact, his reputation in the imperial court was extremely high, and he could be said to be one of the top 3 in the army. In just a few decades, Wu Shengho had risen from a commoner to a rank 3 great general. From this, one could see a thing or two about Wu Shengho's status. He had been stationed at the border for more than 20 years and had prepared for more than 20 years. Even in his dreams, he had been thinking about how to attack Dayo. Now, he could finally achieve his lifelong wish. The current situation of the war was also in line with his expectations. Next, it would depend on who was better. "How's Lu Pinghai's injury?" Wu Shengho asked without raising his head. "Great General, Lu Pinghai's injury has already recovered by half. He should be fine in another month." The scholar cupped his hands. "There's still time," Wu Shengho said softly. "Li Yuanzhu has sent a letter." "She still doesn't agree," the scholar continued. "As expected." Wu Shengho wasn't surprised. "Have you found Lu Zijian?" "There's no news yet," the scholar continued. The whereabouts of the second most powerful expert in the world, Lu Zijian, had always been unpredictable. As for the world's most powerful expert, Lin Xian, there had been no trace of her for several years. Many people suspected that she was no longer in this world, or that she had broken through the legendary boundary. "Do you think that Qi Zixiao will leave Liao City?" Wu Shengho asked casually. "Absolutely not. If she leaves Liao City, she will be abandoning the tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians in Liao City. Qi Zixiao will never do such a thing. Unless it's a matter of life and death, she won't leave if she drags on like this," the scholar said decisively. Wu Shengho nodded. It was exactly what he thought. By the time she wanted to leave, it would already be too late. Wu Shengho moved his finger from one point to another on the map. Finally, he pressed his finger on one of the points. That was where his target was. Not only was it the only way to Lan City and the Protectorate of the North, but it was also the only way to return to the Protectorate of the Northeast. As long as he occupied this place, even if Qi Zixiao could escape, she would lose a large piece of fertile land in the north. "Is there any news from the Yun nation?" "They are still quarreling in the imperial court," the scholar replied softly. "Have they forgotten that they were almost wiped out by those barbarians?" Wu Shengho sneered in disdain. "Those fellows who are full of the aura of merchants? Even without them, with the great general's long preparation, it's not impossible to take down Dayo," the scholar immediately added. "The walls of Lan City are only 6 meters thick. These catapults will be able to break through Liao City." One had to know that the walls of Tiesua Pass, Shun City, and Ziyue City in the north were all 20 meters thick. Tiesua Pass was even 30 meters thick. On the other hand, the walls of Lan City were only 6 meters thick. As long as the catapults hit it a few more times, they would be able to create a breach. "We can't enter even if we break it," Wu Shengho said faintly. In a place like the city, the strong individual strength of the aboriginals could be unleashed. He would rather let the aboriginals die near the city walls than let the soldiers enter the city to fight the aboriginals. Those aboriginal commoners would probably cause a lot of casualties. Not to mention, there were also the winged cavalry warriors inside. However, if the city walls were really broken through, those thunder cannons that had been developed would come in handy. At the thought of the cannons in his hands called the myriad flower bomb, Wu Shengho felt that the imperial court should really reward those craftsmen handsomely. Just as the two of them were chatting, they heard a few loud sounds that were different from the sound of huge rocks smashing on the city walls. Which bastard used the thunder cannons? This kind of explosion immediately made Wu Shengho think of the Vulcan cannons and the thunder fire powder that were stored in the army. Then, Wu Shengho rejected this idea. Without his order, who would dare to use the thunder cannons? Just as he walked out of the big tent, he heard another loud sound in front of the battle formation. Boom! Wu Shengho frowned. What exactly was going on? This was clearly the sound of the thunder cannons being fired. However, the sound was much louder when it reached here. Before he could figure it out, there were a few more loud sounds in front of him. "Someone, go and see what's going on," Wu Shengho said in a deep voice. After a quarter of an hour, a general wearing iron armor came back. He knelt on one knee and said, "Great General, I don't know why, but a fireball suddenly appeared out of nowhere at the catapult. It was very powerful and completely destroyed the catapult." After another quarter of an hour, there were also urgent reports from the east and west. The catapults in those two directions had also been destroyed. Chapter 353. When are you going back? The Empress asked Rinpochen as soon as she sat down in the same courtyard. I'll go back tonight, Rinpochen replied without hesitation. Bring me wine, popcorn, candy, chocolate, television dramas. The Empress counted with her fingers. Rinpochen was stunned. Your Majesty, we're at war now. Can you be more serious? The metal chain rose from Rinpochen's head and twisted. Just as it formed an S shape, the figure of the Empress, who was beside Rinpochen, suddenly moved. The metal chain quickly retracted, but the Empress grabbed the top of it and pulled it out. What's this? Your Majesty, be gentle, be gentle. Don't break it, otherwise you will. Rinpochen suddenly felt that something wasn't right halfway through his sentence. He quickly swallowed the words he was about to say and burped in a hurry. What will I do? The Empress asked doubtfully. Or I will be out of luck, Rinpochen quickly said. Then he quickly explained the origin of the metal chain. It can actually be like this. The Empress was surprised after hearing it. But very quickly, with a playful look on her face, she pulled out the metal chain on top of Rinpochen's head a little, and then a little more. After pulling out 7 to 8 meters of the metal chain, Rinpochen felt an indescribable pain in his head, causing him to hurriedly scream, "Ouch, ouch," and move closer to the Empress. So it's this long. The Empress saw the limit. She let go and the metal chain retracted into Rinpochen's head at lightning speed. She then patted his head. Your Majesty! Rinpochen wanted to cry but had no tears. What happened to the heaven-grade weapon? What happened to the binding? Why did he suddenly feel as if he was tied to a dog leash just now? Your Majesty, is there any problem with the food in the city? Rinpochen asked. The Empress frowned and replied, it can last for another month. So little? Rinpochen was a little surprised. He thought that the food stored in the city was enough to last for a year and a half. It's already a lot. The Empress felt that Rinpochen's reaction was a little strange. My people mainly eat meat, so there naturally isn't much food in the city. If it wasn't for the fact that after Zeus City was breached, the soldiers and commoners had persuaded all the villages along the way to bring their livestock here when they retreated, there wouldn't have been so much food. However, I only managed to last for so long because I reduced my consumption, the Empress said faintly. What about the food in Tiesua Pass and Shun City? Rinpochen immediately thought of this problem. Half of the space in Tiesua Pass is used to store livestock. It can last longer than here, but not by much, the Empress said. Looks like this war can't last for too long. Now that the North has fortified its defenses and cleared out the wilderness, the food and livestock have been greatly reduced. If this continues for too long, I'm afraid it won't be able to hold on, Rinpochen said as he thought about it. We just need to defeat them within a month. The Water Empress said matter-of-factly. What should we do? Rinpochen was shocked. It seemed like the Empress had her own ideas. Before you came, I was still thinking, Rinpochen, you're here. Now it's you who wants to, Rinpochen. Shall we think of a way to burn Great Xia's rations? Rinpochen immediately had this idea. I don't need too much rations. It's fine as long as you have less rations. Great Xia had 170,000 soldiers here, and they needed a lot of rations. The supply line was long, and it was impossible to get supplies every day. As long as the rations of the Great Xia army were burned, they wouldn't be able to sit still. Of course, the protection of the rations of the Great Xia army was a top priority. It wouldn't be easy to achieve this. All right, the Empress said straightforwardly. In addition to burning the rations, it was also necessary to intercept the rations. Rinpochen immediately suggested eliminating the winged cavalry from scouting and searching for the other party's rations transport team. With the strength of the winged cavalry, they could completely disperse and scout in groups of 2 or 3. After discovering the other party's rations transport team, they would gather together to intercept and burn the rations. Li Qianxiu has already sent people to find their rations transport route. The Empress nodded slightly. Rinpochen felt a little relieved. It seemed like the Aboriginals weren't all brainless. To be able to become the Protector General of a region, he definitely wasn't an ordinary person. It was impossible for others to think of something that Rinpoche immediately thought of. However, presumably, Deyo would also think of it. Rinpoche felt that he needed some good stuff. After chatting with the Empress for a while, Rinpoche told her about the Great Xia army he encountered on his way here and their cannons. After hearing from the Empress, he found out that the Protectorate of the North had already discovered this thing, but it wasn't very powerful and wasn't taken seriously. It's not powerful for a fortified city, but for a stronghold in the wilderness, it's already quite powerful. The other party can use the cannons to destroy the stronghold before charging in. This will reduce the number of casualties. Rinpoche said this because he grew up on Earth and understood the use of gunpowder since he was young. He also knew the power of gunpowder, so he somewhat valued it. In the eyes of the Empress and the other generals, it was the Great Xia practitioners who were under greater pressure. There weren't many Aboriginal strongholds, and most of them fought one-on-one. On the contrary, the Great Xia practitioners were able to fully display their strength. Even after fortifying the strongholds, the role of the Great Xia practitioners in attacking the strongholds couldn't be underestimated. That night, Rinpoche returned to Earth and immediately called Yang Sr., "I want a nuclear bomb." "Impossible." Yang Sen suddenly quivered. "Why did you do this again?" "Sarin gas." "Impossible." "White phosphorus bombs." "Impossible as well." Yang Sen's head was throbbing. "Can the things you want not be so dangerous? None of them can be given to you. We are at war. Did you hear me clearly? We are at war. If you can't do this and that, can we continue our cooperation?" Rinpoche roared as he slammed the table. "I can give you guns and bullets, such as the anti-aircraft machine gun from last time, or conventional equipment like rifles." Although he had heard Rinpoche's explanation before, Yang Sen still felt that it was too strange for the cultivators from the paradise to use these ordinary people's weapons to fight a war. Mortars and incendiary steel ball bombs. Yang Sen hesitated for a while. The power of these weapons wasn't small either. Finally, he nodded slowly and asked, "What caliber?" "Give me 2 Type 93 60mm mortars first and 70 incendiary steel ball bombs." Rinpoche immediately said. Sure enough, dealing with Yang Sen required him to raise the price as high as he could. If Rinpoche had asked for 60mm mortars at the start, he would probably have wanted to give him grenades. At that time, he would have to waste his breath again. Also, a matching instruction manual and a firing table. Also, a few sets of good night vision goggles. Send them over in 2 days. Rinpoche hung up the phone and thought that these things should be enough. The 60mm mortars had a range of 5,564 meters, which was equivalent to 5 kilometers away. They could hit the enemy's main camp from the top of the city wall. The incendiary steel ball bombs had a destructive radius of 20 meters. After the explosion, the steel balls could sweep through the area within a radius of 20 meters. Furthermore, the arsonist could ignite flammable objects within a radius of 12 meters. It was perfect for burning rations and fodder. When he thought about how these things would take at least 2 to 3 days to be delivered, he felt that he should really buy a house near Shanghai so that it would be more convenient to look for Yang Sen or do other things. Rinpoche then took a pen and paper and began to calculate. Each mortar weighed 45 kilograms. 2 sets weighed 90 kilograms. 1 shell weighed 5 kilograms. 70 of them weighed 300 kilograms. He also needed 2 sets of drones, which weighed 30 kilograms. 20 walkie-talkies weighed 40 kilograms. 2 walkie-talkie relay stations weighed 60 kilograms. 2 sets of small solar batteries and solar panels weighed 80 kilograms. All these added up to 650 kilograms. Chapter 354. In the Great Xia Barracks, Wu Shengho sat in the seat of honor and ordered, "Pass down the order. Continue to attack the city today and increase the intensity. Use the scaling ladders to attack the city in turn. Maintain the strength of 3 battalions and attack the city at the same time. Don't give them a chance to catch their breath. Immediately, a general received the order and went to inform the others. That poison warrior arrived at Liao City, right? Wu Shengho asked again. According to the description of the mounted scouts, it should be him, a general below said with his fists cupped. At the mention of the poison warrior, the generals below all looked uncomfortable. After all, no one wanted to meet such a person on the battlefield. It would be too depressing to be poisoned to death without even having the chance to attack. Fortunately, everyone was prepared this time. Have you distributed the Wuma grass? Wu Shengho asked calmly. According to the great general's orders, they have all been sent down, the general immediately replied. Dozens of doctors from Great Xia died before they managed to verify that the remaining toxins in the 9 pavilions, the Liaoning Mountain Pass, and the Falling Moon Gorge were all of the same type. Furthermore, they managed to find a way to alleviate the toxins. It was a type of wushu grass that was commonly seen in the northwest of Great Xia. It was slightly poisonous, but it was just enough to alleviate the toxins. As long as one placed the witch horse grass in their mouths, they would be able to alleviate the poison. In such an open area, even if the other party used poison, the Wuma grass would not cause much damage. As for the side effects of the Wuma grass, they could be completely ignored. In the morning, after breakfast, the Great Xia army arranged their battle formation and began to lead their soldiers to attack the city. Battle cries could be heard from 3 directions. In the south of the city, there were also many mounted scouts, as well as groups of roaming cavalry. However, the Empress, Li Qianxiu, and the rest didn't feel too pressured. Instead, they were in high spirits as they watched him fiddle with the drone. When the drone took off, Li Qianxiu and the other generals exclaimed in surprise again. Half an hour later, the drone landed, and Rinpochen roughly drew the layout of the barracks in the east of the city according to the pictures. Then he compared the details one by one. The fence outside the Great Xia barracks was only 3 meters tall, but after jumping over the wall, there were caltrops scattered all over the place. These caltrops were specially used to prevent the aboriginals from climbing over the wall and launching night attacks. Inside the barracks, there were 4 cannons that Rinpochen had seen before facing each barak gate. The Great Xia army had put in a lot of effort to prevent the aboriginals from launching a night attack. Fortunately, the aboriginals of the aboriginals had come. Of the aboriginals' attack. Now that they had the map, they immediately knew the weak points of the barracks like the back of their hands. They also found a few places where rations might be stored. Rinpochen used 2 drones to take pictures of the Great Xia barracks at the east gate and the north gate from an altitude of 600 meters. The batteries of the 2 drones were charged while Rinpochen flipped through the images of the Great Xia army's battle formation and attack. Of an Rin Xia every one of. Each of the picture was of the Xia of the War of Xiayang and was very of. In the afternoon, Rinpochen carried the mortar up the city wall. War cries could be heard from the top and bottom of the city wall. The entire city wall was filled with people, and there were more than 20 scaling ladders on the city wall. Great Xia's soldiers climbed up the scaling ladders while carrying flying crossbows. Just as they climbed up the city wall, they were chopped down by a sword and fell down with a blood-curdling screech. From time to time, a squad leader would climb up the city wall in an attempt to gain a foothold, but they wouldn't last more than a minute before falling off the city wall. Below the city wall, the archers of Great Xia had already reached a distance of about 100 meters below the city wall and were shooting arrows upward. "Hurry up and get some scarecrows!" Rinpochen subconsciously shouted when he saw this scene. "Sir, what did you say?" Sure Hu asked as he brandished his blade and cut down a few arrows that were flying towards them. "Get some scarecrows here. The arrowheads will break when these arrows land on the ground." Rinpochen pointed at the arrows that had landed on the stone building behind him with a look of resentment on his face. These arrows were much better than the bone arrows used by the aboriginals. Furthermore, the arrows in the city were getting lesser and lesser. These arrows could be used to replenish the supply. However, if the arrowhead were to crash into a rock and fall off, the flight would be unstable and the arrow would be useless. After finishing his sentence, Rinpoche looked outside the city wall and immediately retracted his head. He carried the mortar down the city wall and shouted to Sherhu, "Quickly get Surly to put some scarecrows on the city wall. Then, get some wood and straw to cover the back of the city wall so that these arrows can be used." After yelling, Rinpoche found a flat ground to place the mortar. He adjusted the angle of the mortar according to the firing meter and scope, stepped on the bottom of the bracket with one foot, pointed to the guard beside him, and said, "Come and support this." After the guard supported the mortar, Rinpoche put the mortar into the barrel, released it, and quickly covered his ears. With a slight clang, the mortar fell to the bottom of the barrel, and the firing mechanism at the bottom of the mortar was activated. Bang! A shell flew out of the barrel, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. The sound was softer than what Rinpoche had imagined. It was a little like the sound of popcorn exploding on the street when he was young. Rinpoche quickly ran to the city wall. Halfway there, he heard a boom outside the city. He climbed up the city wall and quickly looked for the landing point of the mortar. It was easy to find as long as he could see a place with a lot of people. With a radius of 20 meters, it was more than 1,000 square meters. When Rinpoche looked out, he saw a lot of people lying on the ground behind the archers. There were at least 300 to 400 casualties, and many of their limbs were nowhere to be found. The steel balls in the mortar flew in all directions at the moment of the explosion, hitting the people in the area like sieves. At the same time, countless sparks also fell in the surroundings, igniting the clothes of many soldiers, and the area was in chaos. A few lucky people who escaped the disaster stood in the pile of corpses, looking at the tragic situation around them and listening to the screams of the injured. Their faces were full of sluggish expressions. The people around them were also shocked by this unforeseen event. Many of them were at a loss and didn't know what had happened. Looking at the mutilated people, their faces revealed a look of horror. For these soldiers, killing with real swords and guns and this kind of attack that they didn't know what was going on were two different things. Soon, under the urging of the rear, they rushed toward the city wall again. "It's crooked." Rinpoche spat on the ground. However, the power was greater than he had expected. One mortar could kill 3 to 4 people, 10 could kill 3 to 4,000 people, and 70 could kill 20 to 30,000 people. He could eliminate 1/3 of these great Xia soldiers in 2 trips. If he was more diligent, he could make the great Xia soldiers outside the city cry in a month. However, this was just a thought. The great Xia soldiers weren't fools and would probably find a way to reduce the casualties after a period of time. Furthermore, if the other party wasn't so concentrated, they wouldn't be able to achieve such great results. "Sir Ren, this thing is really too powerful." A few guards at the side couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. Rinpoche couldn't be bothered with them. This thing was already a modern standard equipment, so of course it was powerful in the eyes of these people. Previously, when he used an electric baton, they all regarded it as a divine weapon. After confirming the position, Rinpoche ran down the city wall again, adjusted the angle of the mortar, and fired another mortar shell. Boom! A mortar shell suddenly fell from the rear of the great Xia archers. Countless steel balls were shot in all directions like bullets, and a large number of sparks scattered in all directions. The steel balls shot in all directions, turning the archers in front and the shield bearers in front into sieves. Rinpoche climbed up the city wall and carefully examined it for a long time before spitting out, "Damn it, it's crooked again." He returned to the bottom of the city wall, adjusted the angle, fired the mortar, and fired. Boom! Rinpoche climbed up the city wall and saw that there was another man-made no-man's land below. Everyone in the vicinity had become corpses and were lying on the ground, wailing in pain. It was still a little crooked, but the distance was still acceptable as it was only 10 meters off. For Rinpoche, this was already within an acceptable range. After the battle was over, it was time to pack up. Rinpoche carried the mortar back to the city commander's residence. The Empress, who was focused on watching a television series, raised her head and asked, "I heard that the effect is pretty good?" "Indeed, it's pretty good." Rinpoche gave her a thumbs up. "Are you going to use this to launch a night attack?" The Empress asked again. It's to burn the rations and launch a night attack, Renbaqian corrected her. After a while, Li Qianxiu, who had heard the news, rushed over and laughed. Principal Ren, I heard that you have something good. Let me try it. I will let you have a look at it tonight. Renbaqian waved his hand. Great! Li Qianxiu was overjoyed. Now that he had the blueprints of the Great Xia barracks and the weapons in Renbaqian's hands, he could finally teach those Great Xia people a lesson. Not long after Renbaqian left, Wu Shengho frowned as he looked at the shields in front of him that were embedded with many 3mm marbles. What was it this time? He suddenly felt that some variables had appeared in this war. Where did those barbarians get their hands on these weapons that were so lethal? The day before yesterday, the catapults in 3 directions were destroyed, and today, thousands of soldiers were injured or killed with just 3 loud bangs. This situation was completely beyond his expectations. If the other party continued to use such weapons, how could he stop them? Furthermore, there were already 2 types of weapons that he had never seen before. Did those barbarians have anything else? Chapter 355. Walkie-talkies. Do you all know what they are? Renbaqian placed a row of walkie-talkies on the table. Li Qianxiu's subordinates were eager to take action. Each winged cavalry captain had one, and they had long been envious of it. If you don't understand, ask someone who does, Renbaqian said faintly. Everyone take one. Dozens of hands swept across the table, and only 3 walkie-talkies were left. The military system of the Protectorate of the Center was different from that of the winged cavalry. There was 1 captain for every 100 winged cavalry soldiers, and they were all at the advanced level of the Earth Will level or above. In the Protectorate of the Center, a captain led 300 soldiers, and they were generally at the intermediate level of the Earth Will level. Put this in the city. As long as you are within 15 kilometers of Liao City, you can use it as a transit point. Renbaqian put the repeater station aside. This night vision device. Sir Li, you can arrange for these too. Don't use it during the day. Renbaqian took out 5 pairs of infrared night vision devices. 2 of them were for the Protectorate of the Center, 2 were for the winged cavalry, and the last one was for himself. This thing is an infrared imaging device. Different temperatures show different colors, and it can be detected even from inside a tent. Through this device, you can see if the other party is in the camp and if there is an ambush. Later on, you can go out and try it on each other. This device can see heat emitted by humans, animals, and even torches. Pay attention to distinguish them, Renbaqian explained. Thinking back to the rumors on the internet that infrared could see through clothes, Renbaqian was a little excited when he got this device. He immediately drove a few laps on the streets. He only realized that it was pure nonsense after he tried it himself. This device could see the heat emitted by the human body. What could it see from the heat emitted by the human body? It was all red and yellow color blocks. The eyes of the group of people at the side lit up like lasers after listening to him. What was the most frightening thing about a night attack? The most frightening thing was that the other party was already prepared and waiting for you to walk into a trap. With this device, it could be seen at a glance whether the other party was sleeping in the camp. Or if the other party was lying in ambush, it could be seen at a glance. It can only see through materials like tents that can penetrate light. Remember, it can't work on walls. Do you all know about this mission? Renbaqian asked again. Everyone nodded. Remember, even if you are surrounded by thousands of flowers, don't let a single leaf touch you. Run away after you're done flirting, and you won't be responsible for it. Renbaqian saw that everyone nodded their heads and didn't say anything else. He believed that Li Qianxiu had already made arrangements for these matters. It's a moonless and windy night. It's time to sneak around. Let's go. Renbaqian waved his hands. Everyone, 5,000 people slipped down the rope without even opening the east gate. If it wasn't for the loud sound of landing, many people would have jumped down the wall. Renbaqian stood at the top of the city wall and scanned the surroundings with his night vision goggles. He saw 2 groups of soldiers about 1 kilometer away, and it seemed like they were sent by the Great Xia army to patrol. Apart from that, there were also a few scattered dots, which were the hidden sentries of Great Xia. Take care of everything, Rinpoche instructed the guards, turned to look at the Empress and asked, Your Majesty, you don't have to go, right? The Empress thought for a long time and said faintly, Since I have nothing to do, I can't sleep anyway. When Rinpoche grabbed the rope and landed on the ground, the Empress moved and appeared beside him. After arranging the troops, everyone slowly moved toward the northeast. The Great Xia patrolling soldiers emitted a dazzling glow through the night vision goggles. They could be seen from a few kilometers away and could directly avoid them. As for the hidden sentries, they were pinched to death by the winged cavalry. 5,000 people advanced all the way to a suitable position. Li Qianqiu turned to look at Rinpoche, and after seeing him nod, he waved his hand. The winged cavalry and the soldiers from the protectorate of the center split into two groups and moved toward the eastern and northern camps of Liao City. Rinpoche waved his hand to get someone to bring the mortars and ammunition boxes over. Then he adjusted the angle of the mortars. 2 mortars, one facing the eastern camp and the other facing the northern camp, were aimed at the location where the rations were stored, which had been photographed by the unmanned reconnaissance aircraft during the day. In any case, the positions were known, and the angle was adjusted. As for whether they could hit the targets, it was up to fate. At the thought of this, Rinpoche felt that he had forgotten something during the night raid and had forgotten to offer the 3 animals. In position in the east. We are 300 meters away and can't get any closer. In position in the north, 350 meters away. Rinpoche rubbed his hands, turned to the Empress and asked, Your Majesty, do you want to give it a try? The Empress was a little tempted. It seemed rather interesting. How do I do it? In a while, both of us will put the cannonball into the barrel together. When I say to fire, just let go. Rinpoche handed her a cannonball and got 2 guards to hold the body of the cannon. Rinpoche stuffed the end of the cannonball into the barrel. After seeing that the Empress followed his instructions, he slowly said, 1, 2, 3, fire. Bang! Bang! The sounds of the 2 cannonballs overlapping each other were heard. At the same time, smoke rose from the muzzle and shot into the sky. Fire! Fire! After each of them fired 3 cannonballs in a row, Rinpoche began to adjust the angle of the mortars and moved to another location. When a loud explosion was heard from the Great Xia barracks in the distance, the Empress's eyes lit up. This thing was indeed very interesting. The sudden explosion immediately alarmed the Great Xia barracks. It's a night raid! Such shouts immediately spread throughout the barracks. Soldiers were rushing out of their tents with weapons in hand, creating a scene of chaos. Suddenly, the shouts rang out from outside the Great Xia barracks. Figures appeared beside the fence, kicked it down with a few kicks, ran for a distance, and leaped a few meters over the caltrops scattered on the ground. The long sabers in their hands also slashed at the Great Xia soldiers who had just run out of the tents in front of them without even putting on their clothes. These caltrops happened to be inside the fence where the lights couldn't reach. If it wasn't for the fact that there were drones to detect them in advance, many of them would have been killed. Furthermore, the edge of the caltrops happened to be at the edge of the fence after it fell. It was obvious that the other party was eager for them to launch a night raid. Just as the soldiers who launched a night raid rushed into the barracks, the sounds of killing and chaos immediately increased. Blood and severed limbs were scattered everywhere on the ground and the surrounding tents. Fire! 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 Another 6 cannonballs exploded into the 2 barracks separately. When they exploded, the sparks that sprayed into the surroundings immediately ignited the surrounding provisions, fodder, and tents. There's a fire! Such shouts came one after another and intertwined with the sounds of killing in the distance. A few of the winged cavalry warriors were killing to their heart's content in the barracks. Seeing that a group of hundreds of Great Xia soldiers had already gathered in the distance, one of the winged cavalry warriors grinned and said, "Block them for me." After saying that, he took out a black round tube from his pocket, lit it with a match, and threw the explosive tube at the other party. Boom! The explosive directly exploded in the middle of those people. A few of the winged cavalry warriors shouted, "Kill!" They wielded their sabers and leaped forward. Like tigers entering a flock of sheep, the sabers and blood splattered among the people who were still standing. In just a short while, only a few winged cavalry warriors were left standing, covered in blood, and they continued to kill in other directions. Such scenes could be seen everywhere in the entire barracks. For this night raid, Renbachien had brought all the things that he could bring. Renbachien looked at the flames in the distance and listened to the sounds of killing. He quickly adjusted the angle of the mortar and didn't forget to take out a white rabbit creamy candy from his pocket and hand it to the Empress. Chapter 356. Wu Shengho stood in front of the big tent. A group of soldiers and generals had already gathered around him, and more soldiers were gathering in his direction. Those aboriginals were only killing from afar. When they saw the situation here, they didn't come over at all and simply turned to kill in other directions. "Sir, there are at least 2,000 barbarians, and a lot of rations have been burned," the general on night patrol immediately reported. When the first shell landed and exploded, he reacted and immediately gathered the soldiers who had been awakened. However, the tent was too big. There were tens of thousands of people in the tent, and he could only gather a small portion of them. Other than the fact that the Aboriginals' attacks had caused the soldiers in some places to panic, there were also attacks coming from an unknown source that would create loud noises. The combination of these two factors made the barracks even more chaotic, and it was even more difficult to control the chaos. "Arrange the battle formation and press forward. Gather the other soldiers and don't give those barbarians any chance," Wu Shengho said in a deep voice. As long as this group of soldiers stopped those barbarians, the other soldiers would be like a small stream flowing into the sea, and the chaos would naturally be pacified. "Dou Liqing, bring some men to gather the other soldiers, look after the rations, and put out the fire," Wu Shengho continued. His voice was calm and didn't have the slightest hint of panic. The commander wasn't panicking at all, and the others were more or less at ease. "Yes." Another general immediately received the order and left. In less than 15 minutes, another explosion occurred near the rations. 3 mortar shells were fired consecutively, and some soldiers guarding the rations were blown into the sky. A general's gaze pierced through the chaotic barracks like a sharp arrow and directly looked into the darkness in the distance. Just now, he heard a few noises in that direction. It wasn't loud, but he caught it. He leaped up and landed on the top of a flagpole and looked into the distance. From this position, he could even see a corner of the barracks in the east of Liao City. "Great General, that attack came from the sky. Another rations camp was destroyed, and all the soldiers nearby have lost their combat power." A low-ranking general covered in blood hurried over. Hearing this, Wu Shengho's brows furrowed even more. "From the sky? Did you see anyone in the surroundings?" "Sir, there are no aboriginals in the surroundings. That thing fell from the sky and then suddenly exploded. Several hundred of our brothers died just like that," the officer miserably said. "Great General, I suspect that the attack that made the loud noise was launched from a distance like a catapult or a thunder cannon." The general, whose gaze was like a sharp arrow, jumped down and said. At the same time, he pointed to the southeast of the barracks, where the aboriginals had attacked. "Judging from the sounds, General Jia of the East Camp is also under attack. I suspect the situation should be similar. The enemy attacked us and General Jia at the same time. The position where the enemy threw the cannon should be somewhere between the main camp and the East Camp. Just now, I heard the sound from there. It was similar to the sound of the thunder cannon being fired." Hearing this, Wu Shengho's expression suddenly changed, and he asked in a deep voice, "How is the Wu camp now?" "Sir, the Wu camp has not been affected," someone immediately replied. "If we send out the Wu camp, they will definitely attack again. We must find out where they are and how they are doing it. It would be best if he could snatch back some of the enemy's weapons. Qinshe, follow them. If it succeeds, you will be given credit." Although the chaos in the main camp continued, Wu Shengho's mind was already occupied with more important issues. He had to get his hands on the weapons used by the aboriginals. Even if he couldn't, he had to at least find out what the enemy was using and where their weaknesses were. Just as he finished arranging the personnel and neatly arranged the soldiers into a formation, several loud noises suddenly rang out from the position where the soldiers were gathered. When a few winged cavalry warriors saw the explosives exploding in the midst of the enemy, they laughed loudly, turned around, and ran away. "Sir, there are a lot of people coming from the main camp of Great Xia." Without looking up, Renbachien adjusted the angle and fired 3 more rounds with the Empress. Then, he took the night vision goggles and looked in the direction that the guard was pointing. So many people? Renbachien was slightly surprised. Through the infrared night vision goggles, he saw a large wave of people dressed in red and yellow running in this direction. "They aren't ordinary soldiers," Renbachien added. This could be seen from the movement and speed of the other party. The other party seemed to have confirmed the direction and were quickly advancing in this direction. Although they tried to maintain a similar speed, it was obvious that there was some confusion. Renbachien felt that these people didn't look like ordinary Great Xia soldiers. This could be seen from their movements. They were very agile even though it was nighttime. They were either experts in the army or practitioners from Great Xia. "Sir, don't worry. With us around, we will definitely not let them get close." The guard at the side rubbed his palms and smiled. After being exposed to the wind for half a day, they had finally arrived. In addition to Renbachien's and the Empress's guards, there were also more than 100 winged cavalry warriors. There should be no more than 1,000 people on the other side. More than 200 Earthwheel experts were enough to make them run over and crawl back. "In that case, you guys go ahead. Leave 2 people for me to carry the bombs." Renbachien saw that they were all in high spirits, so he simply ignored them and continued to fire his own bombs. Just now, he had already fired 5 rounds and a total of 30 mortar shells. There were only 7 places where the other party stored their rations. After blowing up the other 2 locations, he could use the remaining dozen mortar shells to bombard the first location. If the other party had people fighting the fire, they would have hit the jackpot. Or, if there were any missed bombs, he could make up for it this time. Renbachien and the Empress continued to fire excitedly. Other than a few guards, the rest of the people surrounded the incoming people. Many of the Great Xia practitioners ran to a place not far from their target. With the help of the moonlight, they saw a black mass of heads not far away. "Be careful, there's an ambush," someone shouted. "Ambush my ass," an aboriginal winged cavalry warrior scolded. "Was there a need for an ambush to deal with you guys?" He drew his saber and met them head-on. As soon as the 2 sides collided, the Great Xia practitioners were stunned. Although they expected there to be guards, they didn't expect them to be Earthwheel experts. There were more than 200 of them, and all of them were at the Earthwheel level. 1/6 of the winged cavalry warriors were here. Fortunately, they had a lot of people and many experts, so they were already prepared for an encounter with the winged cavalry. The Great Xia practitioners immediately got into formation. Most of the sects formed small and big formations to barely resist these winged cavalry warriors and guards. Some of the remaining experts and disciples joined forces to deal with these winged cavalry warriors, and a small number of people tried to cross the crowd and rush to the back. A man leaped more than 10 meters into the air, and a 6-meter-long spear as thick as the mouth of a bowl suddenly appeared in his hand. As soon as the spear appeared, everyone could immediately feel a huge pressure. Mountain-breaking spear, Xiao Shan has made his move. The Great Xia practitioners saw this scene and became very spirited. This was one of the 2 spirit wheel experts in the military camp. The spirit wheel level wasn't as simple as being 1 level higher. If the 2 experts were comparable in strength, dozens of Earthwheel experts wouldn't be a match for a spirit wheel expert who had condensed a heaven-grade weapon. With him making his move, even if the other party was these winged cavalry warriors, they wouldn't lose this time. Needless to say, there was still a spirit wheel expert. This time, they would definitely win. Spirit wheel level? Many of the winged cavalry looked up and continued to do what they were supposed to do. Her Majesty was still behind them. So what if he was a spirit wheel expert? The man named Xiao Shan in the air had a stern look on his face. Although the spear in his hand was still a little illusory, it was already enough for him to be proud of. Then, like a missile, he followed the momentum of the spear and pierced toward Rinpoche's position with the force of 1,000 kilograms. Rinpoche's hair immediately stood on end, and his whole body stiffened. The feeling of impending disaster filled his whole body. Good spear technique. So domineering. Some of the great Xia practitioners immediately praised loudly. They boasted that if they were to face the spear, they probably wouldn't even have the chance to escape. Although many of the great Xia practitioners were fighting, many of them were paying attention to Xiao Shan's moves, hoping to learn something from him. After all, it wasn't easy to see a spirit wheel expert in action. Umph! The Empress's cold snort resounded throughout the audience. In a flash, she appeared in front of Xiao Shan and forcefully stepped on the tip of the spear. Xiao Shan suddenly couldn't control himself and plunged downward. When Xiao Shan heard the shouts from below, a sense of heroism rose in his heart. However, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him and stepped on the tip of his spear, causing him to lose control. He immediately felt that something was wrong. When he saw the appearance of that person from the corner of his eye, he was scared out of his wits. He pushed the spear downward with both hands and borrowed the force to flip backward. Without saying a word, he turned around and ran. The spear pierced a hole that was dozens of meters deep into the ground and disappeared. Although he knew that Qi Zixiao was in Liao City, he didn't expect her to actually make a move personally. Furthermore, she was here. He originally thought that even if Qi Zixiao made a move, she would be targeting Wu Shenghe. When he saw the chaos in the camp just now, he thought that even if Qi Zixiao made a move against Wu Shenghe, he would be able to dodge. He didn't expect her to actually be here, and he just had to walk right into a trap. "Where are you running to?" the Empress said coldly. In a flash, she appeared behind Xiao Shan and punched him. Xiao Shan quickly turned around and used both his hands to block. He immediately spat out a mouthful of blood and was sent flying dozens of meters away. Then he ran away at an even faster speed. Using that mouthful of blood just now, he used the simplest method to stimulate his potential. Although he would have to rest for 8 to 10 days after this, it was already a great fortune for him to be able to escape. Many of the great Xia practitioners below saw Xiao Shan condense a heaven-grade weapon with their own eyes. They saw with their own eyes that a red figure appeared in front of him. They saw with their own eyes that when a figure in red appeared, he immediately spat out blood and fled. This scene immediately sent many of the great Xia practitioners, who had just become excited, into hell. Qi Zixiao. They would be fools if they still didn't know who this was. As for the other spirit wheel expert, he had just sensed the Empress's appearance and immediately slipped away without even showing his face. The Empress landed on the ground with her hands behind her back and her head raised as she walked back to Rinpoche's side. "Your Majesty's divine might is matchless. Even an expert who has condensed a heaven-grade weapon will flee at the mere sight of you." Rinpoche took out a handful of chocolate and stuffed it into the Empress's hands. Chapter 357. Junior sister, you go first. I will bring up the rear. Senior brother. The woman's voice was full of twists and turns, and it was heartbreaking. Senior sister, go quickly. Another young man grabbed the woman's hand and ran. When the senior brother saw this scene, his eyes widened and he almost vomited blood. This damn gigolo. Although this world didn't have such incisive summaries as, if you die, other men will sleep with your wife, live in your house, beat your children, and spend your money, his current mood was exactly the same. He almost spat out a mouthful of envy mixed with old blood. Junior brother, you bring up the rear. I will go first. Another man with a pale face saw that the situation wasn't good, threw down this sentence, and ran away. The moment he turned around, he was stabbed in the back. When he threw himself forward, he realized that his junior brother, who had been fighting alongside him, had already run 20 meters away. Senior brother, I will take care of your wife and children. The junior brother turned his head and saw his senior brother looking at him with bloodshot eyes. He shouted with a face full of grief and ran even faster. When a spirit wheel expert vomited blood and ran away, the The rest of the people didn't dare to stay after seeing the situation and ran away one after another. Some of the elders from their sects were still relatively orderly as they gradually retreated from the battlefield. There were also some elders who went to other places. Only a few of their fellow disciples were left, and it depended on their individual skills. There were also some who stayed and fought to the death. Most of them had poor skills or were entangled too deeply. Knowing that they couldn't escape, they could only struggle and wait for their fellow disciples to escape to help them take care of their families. A very small number of them simply fought until their eyes were bloodshot and their minds were filled with desperate thoughts. "Stop chasing!" Renbachien shouted and called back the winged cavalry warriors who were chasing after them. Most of these great Xia practitioners had good skills and weren't something that the aboriginals, who were only good at brute strength, could catch up with. "Sir." Everyone resentfully turned back and conveniently stabbed the one who was still gasping for breath on the ground. Great Xia had lost at least 200 of their 700 to 800 people in just one exchange. "Bring me my spear. I will let them run 600 meters first. They can count themselves lucky if they escape, but they are unlucky if they don't," Renbachien said with a benevolent look. If the winged cavalry caught up with those people, it wouldn't be easy for him to shoot. After setting up the gun, Renbachien put on the night vision goggles, stretched out his hands, and waved to both sides. "Get out of the way. If you get accidentally injured, there will be no compensation." Everyone quickly moved to the sides. Through the infrared night vision device, Renbachien saw a patch of alternating red and yellow in the distance. He took aim, spat, and pressed the trigger on both sides of the handle. Da-da-da. The metal bullets formed a long line and pounced towards the great Xia warriors who had run 700 to 800 meters away. They didn't catch up to us. The great Xia practitioners who were running heaved a sigh of relief when they realized that the aboriginal winged cavalry didn't catch up to them. "Let me go," a woman said angrily. "Senior sister, I was in a hurry just now." The man revealed a fawning smile. "Senior brother." The woman turned her head towards the darkness that seemed to be able to devour everyone and shed tears. What remained in her heart was bone-deep hatred. The man looked behind him, then looked at the crying woman. In the end, he sighed softly, but his heart was much more relaxed. "Senior sister, it's not safe here. Let's go back to the camp first," the man said as he pulled the woman's arm. "It's none of your business." The woman pushed him away. However, in the next second, the huge dragon formed by the metal bullets that attacked from the darkness instantly smashed her into pieces, and her severed head fell directly into the arms of the man. Before the man could react to the sudden change, he had already embarked on the same fate as the woman. The speed of the bullets was too fast, and it was pitch black all around. Most of the practitioners were hit before they could even realize it. As long as their limbs were grazed by the bullets, they would immediately be sent flying into the sky. No one had expected such an unforeseen turn of events. The people who had just escaped and heaved a sigh of relief felt as if they had fallen into an icy abyss. "Spread out and escape quickly," an expert immediately shouted when he realized that the bullets that were shot from the darkness could penetrate another person after penetrating one. When Renbachien threw the ammunition belt to one side and reloaded it, he realized that the great Xia practitioners were running everywhere like sheep. He fired again and hit more than 10 people. Then, he put the gun aside and continued to fiddle with the mortars. However, this time, he changed the position and directly aimed at the vicinity of the enemy's camp gate. Although the other party had scattered and escaped, there was still a large number of Aboriginal soldiers on the east side of the camp. The battle cries hadn't stopped yet, so most of the people ran toward the camp gate. Although there weren't any more attacks in the last part of the journey, everyone was still on tenterhooks. The moment they reached the camp, they could finally relax a little. "I'm irreconcilable with those barbarians," some of the practitioners said through gritted teeth with bloodshot eyes. From the moment they met to the moment they ran back to the camp, almost all of them had relatives and friends who had died outside. Anger and hatred filled everyone's hearts. "We will take revenge sooner or later," someone else said. When they reached a safe place, some of the weaker ones or those who had lost their loved ones couldn't help but feel sad. They hid their tears in their eyes and tried hard not to let them fall. Let's go back first. There will be plenty of opportunities for revenge in the future, someone said. A peak Earthwheel expert's ears twitched, and he suddenly raised his head and exclaimed, "Watch out for the top of your head." Everyone quickly looked up. However, the sky was too dark and they couldn't see very far. While everyone was still looking, a dark green shell fell from above and landed right on top of an Earthwheel expert's head. That Earthwheel expert, who had just lost his good friend, was filled with anger and had nowhere to vent his anger. When he saw a strange object that didn't even have a tip falling from above, he didn't even think twice and raised his hand to meet it. Boom! Although everyone wasn't standing too close together, they had just run into the camp and weren't standing too far away. This explosion instantly cleared out a large area. Rinpoche still didn't know that his mortar had succeeded. He had the mentality of scaring them to death even if he couldn't bomb them. Did they think that they would be fine after running back to the camp? He would let them see what a long-range attack was and what a big fireball was. "Call me a mage in the future," Rinpoche said to the guard beside him and continued to adjust the angle of the mortar. "Sir, what's a mage?" one of the guards asked in a silly voice. "You don't need to know. Just call me that." Rinpoche didn't raise his head and felt a little regretful. It was a pity that he didn't have gasoline bombs and only had 2 mortars. Otherwise, he would have shown them what the 5 fireballs were like. Inform them to withdraw. Rinpoche estimated that it was about time, especially since there was only a small area left in the east of the northern camp. Yes. The night attack is over. Everyone, withdraw according to the predetermined route. Winged cavalry bring up the rear. The guard used the walkie-talkie and used the terminology he learned from Rinpoche. Chinze copy. Chapter 358. Sir Ren, they have already withdrawn and are on their way back. Rinpoche heard the voice from the walkie-talkie and looked at the 2 barracks. There weren't any great Xia soldiers chasing after them. After all, the strength of the Aboriginals could be better utilized in such a dark night. Furthermore, the 2 barracks had just barely calmed down. He reckoned that treating the wounded, extinguishing the fire, and gathering the disorderly soldiers would take them quite some time. The matter is settled. Withdraw. Rinpoche asked his men to carry the mortars, machine guns, and ammunition boxes. Everyone then withdrew unhurriedly. When they arrived at the bottom of the city, they saw that the city gate was wide open, and everyone filed into the city. Not long after everyone returned to the city commander's residence, the casualties were also reported. There weren't many casualties, only a few hundred. Among them, the winged cavalry's losses were negligible. On the other hand, the Protectorate of the Center lost 300 to 400 soldiers. However, half of them returned with serious injuries, and only about 200 died in battle. The Aboriginals' losses were negligible compared to Great Xia's. The Great Xia army lost at least 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers, and a large amount of rations were burned. However, Rinpoche's attention was attracted by something that the winged cavalry warriors who returned described. At the end of the night attack, due to the Aboriginals killing in the barracks, the barely gathered troops encountered a batch of bombs and were unable to counterattack. As a result, the eastern barracks brought out a few cannons. The winged cavalry warriors didn't take these things seriously at first, but after the other party ignited the cannons, countless iron nails shot out. A few of them were careless and died on the spot. There were more injured winged cavalry warriors, at least 20 of them. Rinpoche held the iron nails in his hand and sized them up. They were about half a foot long and as thick as a pinky. They were made of pig iron and had a hexagonal base that was slightly larger than the diameter. "What's the range of this thing?" Rinpoche asked. "About 200 steps. It can kill people at 100 steps, a winged cavalry captain replied. In other words, those who were killed by this thing were fools who didn't know how to dodge when someone pointed this thing at them from 100 steps away, right? Rinpoche grumpily asked. The winged cavalry warrior scratched his head and said, The main thing is that I didn't expect that even though this thing can't hit far, it can hit a group of people at close range. Its strength isn't weak either. He also felt that his subordinates had died unjustly. There are many unexpected things. If I point this thing at you, will you dodge? Rinpoche took out a pistol from his waist and pointed it at the winged cavalry warrior's head. Of course we have to hide, the lieutenant hurriedly said. Previously, this Principal Ren had poisoned tens of thousands of people to death. Today, he took out a weapon that could hit the Great Xia soldiers from a few kilometers away. Even though they weren't clear about the specifics, they knew that a bunch of steel balls would sweep out after the explosion and turn people into sieves. Many winged cavalry warriors saw this scene from afar. At present, Rinpoche had become a target in the hearts of the winged cavalry. Even though he looked thin and weak, the weapons in his hands were lethal. Now, as long as it was something he took out, no one dared to underestimate it. No matter what, tonight's night attack was a complete victory, and Sir Ren deserves the most credit. Li Qianxiu laughed. Even though they lost 300 to 400 people, it was more than enough to satisfy Great Xia's losses. Rinpoche waved his hand and looked as if fame and fortune were fleeting clouds to him. Even though we don't know how much rations the other party has lost, they must have lost some. During the night attack, the winged cavalry and the Central Army also saw that the place where they stored their rations was on fire. This was something that Rinpoche had specially asked people to pay attention to. If the other party's rations are greatly damaged, they will definitely ask the rear to transport more rations. In a while, send away some of the walkie-talkies, a repeater station, and a radio station. I suggest that we send some of the winged cavalry warriors with the walkie-talkies, a repeater station, and a radio station out to scout and search separately. If we encounter the fast horses of the Great Xia army, we will immediately intercept and kill them. If we encounter the rations team, we will join forces and take them down if we can. If we can't, we will contact the city through the radio station and send people to provide support. The Empress and Li Qianxiu nodded slightly. Intercepting the other party's rations was a must, and there was nothing wrong with Rinpoche's suggestion. As for the Great Xia soldiers here, they might have two choices. The first is to withdraw their forces to defend and focus on besieging them. After all, this night attack should have hurt them a lot. However, I feel that the other possibility is that they will do something desperate. If the other party's rations are too damaged and the rations team takes a long time to arrive, they may launch a large-scale attack and consume their own forces to exchange for a chess piece with us. What's an exchange? Li Qianxiu immediately asked. If the other party has a severe shortage of rations, for example, they only have enough rations for 100,000 people for 2 days, and the rations team takes 7 days to arrive, what should we do? Even if we cut everyone's rations by half, it won't be enough. When they are so hungry that they can't walk anymore, we will launch a large-scale attack. They won't even have a chance to retaliate. Since that's the case, we might as well consume more than half of their rations. It would be best if they can break into the city, but even if they can't, they can still consume our forces and die a worthy death. Even if their rations are insufficient, the remaining soldiers will be able to last until the rations team arrives. If the other party's rations are too damaged, they may do this. Exchanging their lives for ours is an exchange of chess pieces, Rinpoche concluded. Li Qianxiu frowned and thought for a long time before slowly nodding his head. It's not impossible. If he were to put himself in the position of the other party's general, he would probably make the same choice if he had no other choice. Everyone discussed for a while. Seeing that it was already late at night, everyone went back to rest. Generally, both sides of a war had spies who could obtain a lot of useful information. However, in the war between Dayo and Great Xia, there were almost no spies in the other party's army. Therefore, all the information could only be based on speculation. Everyone in Dayo went back to rest, but the Great Xia barracks were brightly lit. They treated the wounded, put out the fires, counted the corpses, and calculated the losses until dawn. Wu Shengho sat in the big tent with an ashen face, motionless like a stone statue. The sound of hurried footsteps made him lift his eyelids. He looked at the scholar who hurried in and asked in a deep voice, "How is it?" The main barracks suffered 11,000 casualties, the East barracks suffered 23,000 casualties, and there are 392 soldiers left out of 876 in the Wu barracks. As for rations, the East barracks only had 2 days' worth of rations for 60,000 soldiers and lost 75%. The main barracks had 10 days' worth of rations for 170,000 soldiers and lost 60%. The West barracks didn't suffer any losses. How long can the remaining rations last? Wu Shengho asked. The West barracks still have 2 days' worth of rations for 60,000 soldiers. Together with the remaining rations in the East barracks, it is enough for 140,000 soldiers to last a day. The remaining rations in the main barracks are enough for the army to last a little more than 4 days. That is to say, it is enough for 5 days. If the daily rations are halved, it can last for 10 days. However, this way, the soldiers won't be able to attack. How long until the rations arrive? Wu Shengho asked. 10 more days, the scholar replied softly. However, General Wen Yuan and General Zhao Xing should be able to transfer some over. It is more convenient for them to resupply at the border. Inform them, Wu Shengho said in a deep voice. Inform the soldiers to eat their fill. We will attack the city in 4 hours. Sir? The scholar was shocked. The soldiers didn't rest for the whole night. Why were they so anxious to attack the city today? We can't delay any longer, Wu Shengho said with an ugly expression. Do you know about the attack that the Wu barracks encountered yesterday? The scholar nodded his head. Coupled with the thing that attacked the rations last night and the explosive thing that they threw into the crowd, we don't know if the other party still has any tricks up their sleeves. We can't delay any longer. We have to take down Liao City in one go or force them to use all their trump cards, no matter how great the casualties are. Wu Shengho said resolutely. To a general, as long as they revealed their trump cards, they would always be able to find a way to deal with them. Only the unknown was the most terrifying. This was because it was very likely that they would give you a head-on blow when you thought you were about to win. I didn't expect those barbarians to have such things in their hands. The scholar smiled bitterly. I didn't expect that either. Wu Shengho sighed softly. He felt that he was the barbarian now. These things can't be from Dayo. Someone must have given them to them. Capture that person or kill him. General, do you know who it is? The scholar asked. In fact, he had some guesses in his heart. It should be that poison warrior. Yesterday, Qin Shi and Wu Ying went out together and saw someone controlling a weapon from afar. He should be the one in Liao City now. Moreover, it's better to kill the wrong person than to let him go, Wu Shengho said. Ren Baqian was just guessing the situation of the Great Xia army, so there were naturally many discrepancies. However, even though the reasons were different, Wu Shengho's decision was similar to what Ren Baqian had guessed. In the morning, Ren Baqian sat in the hall and ate breakfast with the Empress. There were rolls, noodle soup, and a big basin of meat the size of a washtub. He watched as the basin of meat disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye. Your Majesty, are you full? Ren Baqian asked softly when the basin was empty. The Empress tilted her head, thought for a while, and replied, I'm half full, but I want to take the lead in reducing my appetite. This way, the rations in the city can last for a few more days. Ren Baqian was speechless. The two of them chatted for a while before someone came to report that Great Xia was attacking the city. The two of them looked at each other. Ren Baqian pointed to himself and said, A wise man is always right. The Empress raised her head and thought for a while. There didn't seem to be anything wrong, but she still felt that something was wrong. In the afternoon, Ren Baqian confirmed his previous conjecture. The intensity of the enemy's attack was indeed much higher than before. There were Great Xia soldiers climbing up the city walls at almost every moment, and there were soldiers howling miserably as they fell from the top of the city walls. Another day passed, and the intensity of Great Xia's attack was still increasing. More than 100,000 soldiers took turns to attack, and the three sides of the city walls were in a constant battle from morning to night. Rinpoche walked to the small hall of the city commander's residence and saw Li Qianxiu, who was issuing orders inside. He waited for Li Qianxiu to finish talking to someone before going forward to ask, "Can you still hold on?" "Another 100,000 of them will be fine," Li Qianxiu replied indifferently. Rinpoche nodded and said, "If the pressure is too great, use the remaining explosives." "Didn't you use them the night before yesterday?" Li Qianxiu was puzzled. "I still have one box," Rinpoche replied. The 300 explosive tubes were packed into 2 boxes. He took out half of them when he blew up the catapult that day and used them during the night attack. Now, there was only 1 box left. "Men, follow me to search the houses." When Li Qianxiu heard this, he immediately stood up from behind the table and strode out, calling out to the others as he walked. Chapter 359. 2 days later, Rinpoche brought the box back to Dayo. It was just past noon. Rinpoche carefully put the box away and strolled to the main hall of the city commander's residence. A group of people were hurrying in and out. The empress was sitting at the seat of honor, and no one knew what she was thinking about. "Your Majesty, how's the situation?" Rinpoche walked to her and asked. When the empress heard his voice, her eyes finally focused. She first looked at his face, reached out to take the bag that he was carrying, rummaged through it, and put it beside her feet. Then he said, "Great Xia has been attacking for an entire night. Over the past 2 days, Great Xia has lost at least 30,000 men. There are also 1,500 casualties in the city. Now, the winged cavalry warriors that are left in the city have gone up the city walls to defend." This was the biggest weakness of the aboriginals. Even though they were strong, their numbers were too small. 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers had to defend the city walls in 3 directions. Excluding the few guards at the southern city wall, there were actually less than 2,000 soldiers in each direction, and they had to withstand the continuous attacks from Great Xia. The number of casualties gradually increased, and the pressure on the remaining soldiers increased. This was expected. Great Xia used a forceful attack, and both sides suffered huge losses. Now it was up to who could endure. Rinpoche thought about it and felt that Great Xia shouldn't be able to endure. If they could, he would make them unable to. Rinpoche accompanied the empress in the main hall until it was night time, but Great Xia still had no intention of withdrawing. It was obvious that Great Xia's 100,000 soldiers were taking turns to attack until the thousands of aboriginal soldiers in Liao City couldn't hold on anymore. After dinner, Rinpoche went to the top of the city wall with the accompaniment of the guards. As soon as he went up, he was choked by the smell of blood and the battle cries around him. Rinpoche saw 7 or 8 huge scaling ladders being pushed to the side of the city wall. Those scaling ladders were like mobile buildings. At the top was a platform with dozens of Great Xia soldiers standing on it. When they were very close, they would jump over and attack. Behind the scaling ladders, there were still countless soldiers climbing up the ladder without stopping. "Kill!" Dozens of Great Xia soldiers jumped over and roared with a sinister look on their faces. Most of them only managed to shout the word "kill" before they were cut down and fell to the bottom of the city wall. Only a few of the more powerful aboriginals were able to deal with the aboriginal warriors. A winged cavalry warrior appeared from the side. The long saber in his hand was fast and ruthless, and he managed to kill a few Great Xia soldiers in a few moves. He then brandished his long saber to knock down a few arrows that were shot at him. Another batch of Great Xia soldiers jumped onto the cloud chariot. At this moment, the city walls were filled with torches from top to bottom, brightly illuminating the area dozens of meters below the city walls. There were corpses, damaged military equipment, and a dense mass of Great Xia soldiers below the city walls. Boom! There was a loud bang, and a cloud of fire erupted from the bottom of a ladder in the distance. The ladder was blown up, and the Great Xia soldiers on it screamed miserably as they fell. Needless to say, this was the work of the explosives. Otherwise, it would take a lot of effort to destroy such a huge ladder. But now, a tube of dynamite could easily solve the problem. Then, there were a few more explosions. After all the ladders within his field of vision were destroyed, the Aboriginal soldiers could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Sir Ren. A winged cavalry warrior wiped the blood off his face, cupped his fists at Rinpochen, and sat by the wall to rest. Do the Great Xia soldiers still have any military equipment? Rinpochen asked. It wouldn't be easy for the other party to make such a huge ladder, right? I hope not, that winged cavalry warrior mumbled. Since yesterday morning, they had been fighting continuously for 18 hours. Even though they were earthwheel experts, they still felt tired. However, imagination was always good. Not long after, the Great Xia soldiers rushed up again. This time, it wasn't the Great Xia soldiers who were already exhausted. Instead, it was the elite soldiers who had rested sufficiently and rested for a full 10 hours. They carried ladders that looked like ladders and rushed up again. Damn it! Rinpochen cursed. This time, he had brought a lot of anti-infantry jumping mines and was prepared to bury them outside the city walls. However, if the other party didn't withdraw, how could he bury them? He couldn't possibly bury them on the city walls, right? After walking around the 3 city walls, Rinpochen hurriedly returned to the city commander's residence, took out his Italian cannon, and went directly to the bottom of the city walls. If the other party didn't withdraw, he would blow them up until they did. This time, he had brought back a total of 40 mortar shells, which were still steel ball incendiary bombs. He also brought 50 Type 72 anti-infantry landmines, which had a total of 650 destructive shrapnel fragments. If they were to explode from a height of 1 meter, the destructive power would be even greater than a mortar shell. He took a look at the city wall. It was dark in the distance, and he couldn't see clearly. However, he remembered the areas below the city where there were more people and where there were fewer people. Then, he quickly ran down to adjust the angle of the mortar. A moment later, there was a bang, and smoke was emitted from the muzzle of the mortar. Dozens of seconds later, a ball of fire immediately exploded outside the city. Even the surrounding Great Xia soldiers were swept away, and 2 ladders were directly destroyed. Oh yeah! Rinpochen's voice didn't sound very happy. Instead, it sounded dull. Sir Ren has made a move. The Aboriginal soldiers cheered. Looking at this posture, they knew that Rinpochen had personally made a move. Besides him, no one else could use this thing. The destructive power of those black tube explosions wasn't as great as this one. He adjusted the muzzle and fired again. Boom! The cheers on the city wall were louder. Sir Ren, I want to bear your children. Such a voice came with the wind. Rinpochen's face twitched. Which B** starred shouted this. Do you believe that I'll beat you to death? When the 3rd mortar shell was fired, Rinpochen continued to adjust the angle. When the mortar was fired, there were people cheering on the city wall, but after dozens of seconds, the cheers suddenly stopped. A dud! Rinpochen had this thought. He stuffed the mortar shell into the barrel and fired again. Boom! Then he adjusted the angle and fired again. This time, there was still no sound of an explosion. This time, Rinpochen immediately realized that something was wrong. It would be understandable if there was a problem with 1 mortar shell. However, there was a problem with both shells, so it wasn't a matter of probability anymore. Sir Ren, that thing of yours has been shot onto the wall. A winged cavalry warrior hurriedly shouted as he ran down from the city wall. Rinpochen thought, how can you say that? He also knew that this wasn't the time to stare. Upon hearing this, he immediately knew what was going on, so he quickly got up and ran up the city wall. Where is it? Sir Ren, follow me. That winged cavalry warrior ran along the city wall with Rinpochen, dodging the swords and sabers that were slashing at him from time to time. Rinpochen twisted left and right and weaved his way through the shadows of the swords and sabers. He looked down from the top of the wall where the winged cavalry warrior had stopped and saw a dark-colored mortar shell nailed to the wall by a long arrow. It was still swaying with the wind like an hour hand. So ruthless? Although Rinpochen had already guessed it, he was still a little surprised to see this scene. This was a mortar shell. It could travel hundreds of meters in 1 second. Furthermore, it was still night time. Where did this expert come from? Sir, be careful. Sure, who pushed Rinpochen, and a long arrow whistled through the air as it brushed past Rinpochen's shoulder and disappeared. Do you know where he is? I'll blow him up. Rinpochen was lying on the ground with cold sweat dripping down his forehead. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.